Part 8 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The next case is interesting as showing the mental and emotional development in a very radical case of sexual inversion. History 20. Englishman, of independent means, aged 49. His father and his father's family were robust, healthy, and prolific. On his mother's side, phthisis, insanity, and eccentricity are traceable. He belongs to a large family, some of whom died in early childhood and at birth, while others are normal. He himself was a weakly and highly nervous child, subject to night terrors and somnambulism, excessive shyness, and religious disquietude. Sexual consciousness awoke before the age of 8, when his attention was directed to his own penis. His nurse, while out walking with him one day, told him that when little boys grow up their penises fall off. The nursery maid sniggered, and he felt that there must be something peculiar about the penis. He suffered from irritability of the prepuce, and the nurse powdered it before he went to sleep. There was no transition from this to self-abuse. About the same time he became subject to curious half-waking dreams. In these he imagined himself the servant of several adult naked sailors. He crouched between their thighs and called himself their dirty pig, and by their orders he performed services for their genitals and buttocks, which he contemplated and handled with relish. At about the same period, when these visions began to come to him, he casually heard that a man used to come and expose his person before the window of a room where the maids sat. This troubled him vaguely. Between the age of 8 and 11 he twice took the penis of a cousin into his mouth after they had slept together. The feeling of the penis pleased him. When sleeping with another cousin they used to lie with hands outstretched to cover each other's penis or nates. He preferred the nates, but his cousin the penis. Neither of these cousins was homosexual, and there was no attempt at mutual masturbation. He was in the habit of playing with 5 male cousins. One of these boys was unpopular with the others, and they invented a method of punishing him for supposed offences. They sat around the room on chairs, each with his penis exposed, and the boy to be punished went around the room on his knees and took each penis into his mouth in turn. This was supposed to humiliate him. It did not lead to masturbation. On one occasion the child accidentally observed a boy who sat next to him in school playing with his penis and caressing it. This gave him a powerful, uneasy sensation. With regard to all these points, the subject observes that none of the boys with whom he was connected at this period, and who were exposed to precisely the same influences, became homosexual. He was himself, from the first, indifferent to the opposite sex. In early childhood, and up to the age of 13, he had frequent opportunities of closely inspecting the sexual organs of girls, his playfellows. These roused no sexual excitement. On the contrary, the smell of the female parts affected him disagreeably. When he once saw a schoolfellow copulating with a little girl, it gave him a sense of mystical horror. Nor did the sight of the male organs arouse any particular sensations. He is, however, of opinion that, living with his sisters in childhood, he felt more curious about his own sex as being more remote from him. He showed no effeminacy in his preferences for games or work. He went to a public school. Here he was provoked by boy friends to masturbate, but, though he often saw the act in process, it only inspired him with a sense of indecency. In his 15th year puberty commenced with nocturnal emissions, and at the same time he began to masturbate, and continued to do so about once a week or once a fortnight during a period of 8 months, always with a feeling that was a poor satisfaction and repulsive. His thoughts were not directed either to males or females while masturbating. He spoke to his father about these signs of puberty, and, by his father's advice, he entirely abandoned onanism. He only resumed the practice to some extent after the age of 30, when he was without male comradeship. The nocturnal emissions, after he had abandoned self-abuse, became very frequent and exhausting. They were medically treated by tonics such as quinine and strychnine. He thinks this treatment exaggerated his neurosis. All this time no kind of sexual feeling for girls made itself felt. He could not understand what his schoolfellows found in women, or the stories they told about wantonness and delight of coitus. His old dreams about the sailors had disappeared, but now he enjoyed visions of beautiful young men and exquisite statues. He often shed tears when he thought of them. These dreams persisted for years, but another kind gradually usurped their place to some extent. These second visions took the form of the large erect organs of naked young grooms or peasants. These gross visions offended his taste and hurt him, though at the same time they evoked a strong, active desire for possession. He took a strange, poetic pleasure in the ideal form. But the seminal losses which accompanied both kinds of dreams were a perpetual source of misery to him. There is no doubt that at this time, that is, between the 15th and 17th years, a homosexual diathesis had become established. He never frequented loose women, though he sometimes thought that would be the best way of combating his growing inclinations for males. And he thinks that he might have brought himself to indulge freely in purely sexual pleasure with women if he made their first acquaintance in a male costume, as debaduse cherubino, court pages, young halberdiers, as it is only when so clothed that women on the stage or in the ballroom have excited him. His ideal of morality and fear of venereal infection, more than physical incapacity, kept him what is called chaste. He never dreamed of women, never sought their society, never felt the slightest sexual excitement in their presence, never idealized them. Aesthetically, he thought them far less beautiful than men. Statues and pictures of naked women had no attraction for him, while all objects of art which represented handsome males deeply stirred him. It was in his 18th year that an event occurred which he regards as decisive in his development. He read Plato. A new world opened, and he felt that his own nature had been revealed. Next year he formed a passionate but pure friendship with a boy of 15. Personal contact with the boy caused erection, extreme agitation, and aching pleasure, but not ejaculation. Through 4 years he never saw the boy naked or touched him pruriently. Only twice he kissed him. He says that these 2 kisses were the most perfect joys he ever felt. His father now became seriously anxious both about his health and his reputation. He warned him of the social and legal dangers attending his temperament, but he did not encourage him to try coitus with women. He himself thinks that his own sense of danger might have made this method successful, or that, at all events, the habit of intercourse with women might have lessened neurosis and diverted his mind to some extent from homosexual thoughts. A period of great pain and anxiety now opened for him, but his neurasthenia increased. He suffered from insomnia, obscure cerebral discomfort, stammering, chronic conjunctivitis, inability to concentrate his attention, and dejection. Meanwhile his homosexual emotions strengthened and assumed a more sensual character. He abstained from indulging them, as also from onanism, but he was often forced, with shame and reluctance, to frequent places, baths, urinaries, and so forth, where there were opportunities of seeing naked men. Having no passion for women, it was easy to avoid them, yet they inspired him with no exact horror. He used to dream of finding an exit from his painful situation by cohabitation with some coarse, boyish girl of the people, but his dread of syphilis stood in the way. He felt, however, that he must conquer himself by efforts of will and by a persistent direction of his thoughts to heterosexual images. He sought the society of distinguished women. Once he coaxed up a romantic affection for a young girl of 15, which came to nothing, probably because the girl felt the want of absolute passion in his wooing. She excited his imagination, and he really loved her, but she did not, even in the closest contact, stimulate his sexual appetite. Once, when he kissed her, just after she had risen from bed in the morning, a curious physical repugnance came over him, attended with a sad feeling of disappointment. He was strongly advised to marry by physicians. At last he did so. He found that he was potent and begot several children, but he also found to his disappointment that the tyranny of the male genital organs on his fancy increased. Owing to this cause, his physical, mental, and moral discomfort became acute. His health gave way. At about the age of 30, unable to endure his position any longer, he at last yielded to his sexual inclinations. As he began to do this, he also began to regain calm and comparative health. He formed a close alliance with a youth of 19. This liaison was largely sentimental and marked by a kind of etherealized sensuality. It involved no sexual acts beyond kissing, naked contact, and rare involuntary emissions. About the age of 36 he began freely to follow homosexual inclinations. After this, he rapidly recovered his health. The neurotic disturbances subsided. He has always loved men younger than himself. At about the age of 27, he had begun to admire young soldiers. Since he yielded freely to his inclinations, the men he has sought are invariably persons of a lower social rank than his own. He carried on one liaison continuously for 12 years. It began without passion on the friend's side, but gradually grew to nearly equal strength on both sides. He is not attracted by uniforms, but seeks some uncontaminated child of nature. The methods of satisfaction have varied with the phases of his passion. At first they were romantic and platonic, when a hand touch, a rare kiss, or a mere presence sufficed. In the second period, sleeping side by side, inspection of the naked body of the loved man, embracements, and occasional emissions after prolonged contact. In the third period, the gratification became more frankly sensual. It took every shape: mutual masturbation, intercrural coitus, fellatio, erumatio, and occasionally active pedicatio, always according to the inclination or concession of the beloved male. He himself always plays the active masculine part. He never yields himself to the other, and he asserts that he never has the joy of finding himself desired with ardor equal to his own. He does not shrink from passive pedicatio, but it is never demanded of him. Coitus with males, as above described, always seems to him healthy and natural. It leaves a deep sense of well-being, and has cemented durable friendships. He has always sought to form permanent ties with the men whom he has adored so excessively. He is of medium height, not robust, but with great nervous energy, with strong power of will and self-control, able to resist fatigue and changes of external circumstances. In boyhood he had no liking for female occupations or for the society of girls, preferring study and solitude. He avoided games and the noisy occupations of boys, but was only non-masculine in his indifference to sport, was never feminine in dress or habit. He never succeeded in his attempts to whistle. He is a great smoker, and has at times drunk much. He likes riding, skating, and climbing, but is a poor horseman, and is clumsy with his hands. He has no capacity for the fine arts and music, though much interested in them, and is a prolific author. He has suffered extremely throughout life, owing to his sense of the difference between himself and normal human beings. No pleasure he has enjoyed, he declares, can equal 1,000th part of the pain caused by the internal consciousness of pariahdom. The utmost he can plead in his own defense, he admits, is irresponsibility, for he acknowledges that his impulse may be morbid. But he feels absolutely certain that in early life his health was ruined and his moral repose destroyed, owing to the perpetual conflict with his own inborn nature, and that relief and strength came with indulgence. Although he always has before him the terror of discovery, he is convinced that his sexual dealings with men have been thoroughly wholesome to himself, largely increasing his physical, moral, and intellectual energy, and not injurious to others. He has no sense whatever of moral wrong in his actions, and he regards the attitude of society toward those in his position as utterly unjust and founded on false principles. The next case is, like the foregoing, that of a successful man of letters, who also passed through a long period of mental conflict before he became reconciled to his homosexual instincts. He belongs to a family who are all healthy and have shown marked ability in different intellectual departments. He feels certain that one of his brothers is as absolute an invert as himself, and that another is attracted to both sexes. I am indebted to him for the following detailed narrative describing his emotions and experiences in childhood, which I regard as of very great interest, not only as a contribution to the psychology of inversion, but to the embryology of the sexual emotions generally. We here see described, in an unduly precocious and hypersthetic form, ideas and feelings which, in a slightly and more fragmentary shape, may be paralleled in the early experiences of many normal men and women, but it must be rare to find so many points in sexual psychology so definitely illustrated in a single child. It may be added that the narrative is also not without interest as a study in the evolution of a man of letters. A child whose imagination was thus early exercised and developed was predestined for a literary career. End of Part 8 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker.
Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording, All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 3, Sexual Inversion in Men, Part 9. History 21. Almost the earliest recollection I have is of a dream, from which my vivid collection of its details must have repeated itself, I think, more than once, unless my waking thoughts unconsciously added definition. From this dream dated my consciousness of the attraction to me of my own sex, which has ever since dominated my life. The dream, suggested in part, I think, by a picture in an illustrated newspaper of a mob murdering a church dignitary, took this form. I dreamed that I saw my own father murdered by a gang of ruffians, but I do not remember that I felt any grief, though I was actually an exceedingly affectionate child. The body was then stripped of its clothing and eviscerated. I had at the time no notion of anatomical details, but the particulars remained distinct to my mind's eye, of entrails uniformly brown, the color of dung, and there was no accompaniment of blood. When the abdomen had been emptied, the incident in which I became an active participant occurred. I was seized, and the fact that I was overpowered contributed to the agony of delight it afforded me, and was laid between the thighs of my murdered parent, and from there I had presently crawled my way into the evacuated abdomen. The act, so far as I can decide of a dream at an age when emission was out of the question, caused in me extreme organic excitement. At all events, I used afterward definitely to recur to it in the waking moments before sleep for the purpose of gaining a state of erection. The dream had no outcome. It seemed to reach its goal in the excitement it caused. I was at that time between 3 and 4 years old. I have been told that erections occurred when I was only 2 years old. It was between 3 and 4 that I used to induce, at all events, the sensation of an erection. But I was nearer 5 when, sitting on my bed and waiting to be dressed, I got an involuntary erection and called my nurse's attention to it, asking what it meant. The appearance must, therefore, have been usual to me at that date, but certainly the sensation was not. At that time I was totally ignorant of the conditions of puberty, which afterward, when I discovered them, so powerfully affected me. I could not even visualize the private organs of a man. I made no deductions from myself. The only naked bodies I had seen then, I judged from circumstances, not from any actual memory of the facts, were those of my sisters. In the waking dreams which I began to construct, though I recurred often to the one already narrated, the goal of my desire was generally to nestle between the thighs or to have my face pressed against the hinder parts of the object of my worship. But for a time my first dream so engrossed me that I did not indulge in any promiscuity. Gradually, however, my horizon enlarged, and took in, besides the first mentioned, 3 others: a cousin very much my elder, an uncle, and the curate of the parish. At this stage I began to invent circumstances for the indulgence of my passion. One of the earliest was to imagine myself in a tank with my 3 lovers floating in the water above me. From this position I visited their limbs in turn. The attraction rested in the thighs and buttocks only. I fancy this limitation of the charm to the lower parts only lasted until actual experience of a more complete embrace made me as much a lover of the arms and breast. Indeed, later, I became more emotionally enamored by these parts than all the rest. At the beginning of things I simply loved best what my mind could first get hold of. Quite early in my experience, when I was not more than 5, I awoke earlier than usual, and saw my nurse standing in complete nudity, commencing her toilet. She seemed to me a gross, coarse, and meaningless object. The hair under her armpits displeased me, and still more that on the lower part of her body. In the case of men, directly I came to have cognizance of the same thing on their bodies, the effect was exactly the opposite. It so happened that about this time the gardener had received some injury to his leg, and in showing the bruise to another exhibited before my eyes a skin completely shagged over with dark hair. Though the sight of the bruise repulsed me, My pleasure was intense, and the vision of the gardener's legs was in my bed every night for a week afterward. My point is that the sight of my nurse was liable to rouse interest just as much as the far more prosaic display of the gardener's wounded leg, but my nature made it impossible. It was about this time, if not before, that an enormous sense of shyness with regard to all my private duties began to afflict me. So great was it that I could endure from no hand except my mother's or my nurse's the necessary assistance in buttoning and unbuttoning of my garments, always excepting those who were about my own age, toward whom I felt no privacy whatever. When I was a little more than 15, I formed a friendship with a young clerk, a youth of about 15, though he seemed to me a grown-up person. One day, as he sat at his desk writing, I sat down and began playing with his feet, investigating the height to which his socks went under his trousers. In this way I obtained 6 inches of bare leg. Conscious of my courage, I fell to kissing it. My friend laughed, but left me to my devotions in peace. This was the first time in which a feeling of romance mixed itself in my dreams. The physical excitement was less, but the pleasure was greater. I cannot understand why I never repeated the experience. He remained to me an object of very special and tender consideration. In the next episode I have to relate the ideal was totally absent. The part I played was passive rather than active. I was put to sleep with a boy considerably my senior. His initiation led to a physical familiarity between us which was not warm or kind, and I was allowed no scope for my own instinctive desires for a warmer kind of contact. If I sought it under cover of my companion's slumbers, I found myself kicked away. Only on one occasion did I find a few moments of supreme charm, while his sleep remained sound, by discovering in the recesses of the sheet an exposed surface of flesh against which I pressed my face in an abandonment of joy. For the rest, I was a passive participant, his pleasure seeming to end in the mere handling of the fleshy portions of my body. For this purpose I usually lay face down across his knees. So far as I can remember, this intimacy led to a decrease in my pursuit of imaginative pleasures. For about a year no further development took place. At about this date I was circumcised on account of the prepuce being too long. Between the 6th and 7th years a change of environment brought me into contact with a new set of faces. I had then a bed to myself, and once more my imagination awoke to life. It was at this time that I found myself constructing from men's faces suppositions as to the rest of their bodies. A brown face led me to suppose a uniformly brown body, a pale face, a pale body. This idea of variety began to charm me. I now made definite choice in my reveries whether I would go to sleep between white thighs or red thighs or brown thighs. Going to sleep definitely describes the goal of the method to which I had addicted myself. As soon as I entered my bed I abandoned myself to the construction of an amour, and retained it as long as I had consciousness. I may say that I was not conscious of any emissions under these circumstances, until some years later, when I brought it about by my own act, but the pleasure was fairly acute. All this time there were secret meetings with my bedfellows of the year before, but now they took place by day, in various hiding places, with little unclothing or exposure, and my companion was cold and fastidious, and repelled any warmth on my part. It became to me a dry sort of ritual. I had an idea at the time that the whole thing was so much an original invention of his and mine that there was no likelihood of it being practiced by anyone else in the world. But this consideration did not restrain me in constructing love scenes with all those whose appearance attracted me. At this period nearly every man with whom I came in contact won at least my transient desire. Only the quite old and deformed lay outside the scope of my wishes. Many of my amours developed in church. The men who sat near me were the objects of my attention, and the clergyman, whose sermon I did not listen to, supplied me with an occasion for reverie on the charms of his person, would have for me under other circumstances. It must have been at this time that I began to elaborate ideas of serried rank of congregated thighs across which I lay and was dragged. I would arrange them in definite order and then imagine myself drawn across from one to the other somewhat forcibly. Admiration of strength was beginning at this time to have a definite part in my conceptions, but anything of the nature of cruelty had not then appealed to me. I accept the original dream of my childhood, which seems to me still to stand fantastically apart. In the inventions to which I now gave myself the sense of being passed across limbs of different texture and color was subtle and pleasurable. I think the note of constructive cruelty which now followed arose from an imagined rivalry among my lovers for possession of me. The idea that I was desired made me soon take a delight in imagining myself torn and snatched about by the contending parties. Presently out of this I began constructing definite scenes of violence. I was able in imagination to lie in the thick and stress of conglomerated deliciousness of thighs struggling to hold me. I was able to imagine at least 6 bodies encircling me with passionate contact. At the same time I had an ingrained feeling of my own physical smallness in relation to the limbs whose contact threw me into such paroxysms of delight. A new and sufficiently ludicrous invention took possession of me. I imagined myself strapped to the thighs, always I think the right one, of the man on whom I chose, for the time, to concentrate my desires, and so to be warmed by him during his day's work, hidden beneath his garments. I was not conscious of any difficulty due to my size. The charm of bondage and compulsion was here, again, in the ascendant. I fancy that it was in this connection that I first anticipated whipping as the delightful climax to my emotions, administered when my possessor, at the end of his day's work, unclothed himself for rest. Up to this stage my attraction to the male organ of generation had been slight and vague. 2 things now contributed to bring thought of it into prominence. On 2 or 3 occasions when I accompanied farm labourers to their occupations I saw them pause by the way to relieve nature. My extreme shyness as regards to such matters in my own person made this performance in my presence like an outrage on my modesty. It had about it the suggestion of an indecent solicitation to one whose inclination was to headlong and delirious surrender. I stood rooted and flushing with downcast eyes, till the act was over and was conscious for a considerable time of stammering speech and bewildered faculties. When I afterward reviewed the circumstances, they had the same attraction for me that amorous cruelty was just then beginning to exercise on my imagination. My mind secretly embraced the fearful sweetness of the newly discovered sensation, surrounding the performance of the function with all sorts of atrocious and bizarre inventions. For a time my intellect hung back from accepting this as the central and most fiery secret of the male attraction, but shortly afterward, when walking out with my father, I saw him perform the same act. I was overwhelmed with emotion and could barely drag my feet from the spot or my eyes from the damp herbage where he had deposited the waters of secrecy. Even today, when my mind has been long accustomed to the knowledge of generative facts, I cannot disassociate myself from the shuddering charm that moment had for me. The attraction of my father's person had always had for me was now increased tenfold by the performance I had witnessed, though I had not seen the penis in any of these cases. For a considerable time only those lovers were dominant in my imagination whom I had witnessed in the act had so poignantly affected me. My delight now took the form of imagining myself strapped to the thighs of the person while this function was in progress. By this time I must have been 8 years old. The cold and secret relationship of which I have given an account had continued, without instructing me in any of the ardent possibilities it might have suggested. No force or cruelty was used upon me, no warmth was lavished. It made little difference that my companion had now discovered the act of masturbation. It had no meaning to me, since it led to no warmth of embrace. His method was to avert himself from me. I had to fawn upon him from the rear, and also to invent indecent stories to stimulate his imagination. I felt myself a despised instrument, the mere spectator of an act, which, if directed toward me with any warmth, would have aroused the liveliest appetite. At this time, as I have since seen, my companion was gaining knowledge from the ancient classics. For a time some charm was imparted by his instructing me to adopt a superincumbent face-to-face embrace. The beginning of his puberty was enormously attractive to me. Had he been less cold-blooded, I could have responded passionately to his endearments. But he always insisted on rigorous passivity on my part, and he explained nothing. One day, by a small gratuity, he induced me to offer him my mouth, though I still had no comprehension of the result I was helping to attain. Once the orgasm occurred, and the effect was extremely nauseous. After that he was more careful. My companion was approaching manhood, and his demands became more frequent, his exactions more humiliating. At the same time my passion for male love was growing stronger. I was able to construct from the unsatisfactory bondage in which I was held images of bodily embrace which I had not before had sufficient sense of human contact to form, though I seldom imagined any of the acts that in actual experience repulsed me. One day, however, I shirked a particularly repulsive humiliation which my companion had forced upon me. He discovered the deception, rose from the prone position in which he lay, and throwing me across his knees, thrashed me violently. I submitted without a struggle, experiencing a serious sensation of pleasure in the midst of my pain. When he repeated his order I found its accomplishment no longer repulsive. One of the few pleasurable memories this intimacy, extending over years, has left for me is that moment of abject abasement to one who, with no warmth of feeling, had yet once had sufficient energy to be brutal to me. It must have been from this incident that the calculated effect of flagellation began to have weight with me when I indulged my imagination. A wish to be repulsed, trampled, violated by the object of my passion took hold of my instincts. Even then, and indeed up to my 13th year, I had no idea of normal sexual connection. I knew vaguely that children were born from women's bodies. I did not know, and when told, I did not believe, the true facts of the marital relationship. All that I had experienced, both in fact and imagination, was to me so highly individual that I had no notion any kind kindred to it could exist outside of my own experience. I had no notion of sex as the basis of life. Even when I came gradually to realize that men and women were formed in a way that argued connection with each other, I still believed it to be a dissolute sort of conduct, not to be indulged in by those who had claims to respectability. I had, however, by this time arrived at a strong attraction toward the organs of generation and all aspects of puberty, and my imagination spent itself in a fantastic worship of every sign of masculinity. My enjoyment now was to imagine myself forced to undergo physical humiliation and submission to the caprice of my male captors, and the central fact became the discharge of urine from my lover over my body and limbs, or if I were very fond of him, I let it be in my face. This was followed usually by a half-caressing castigation, in which the hand was only instrumental. The period of which I am now writing was that of my own entry into school life. My imaginary lovers immediately became numerous. All the masters and all the boys above a certain age attracted me, for too I had in addition a feeling of romantic as well as physical attachment. Indeed, from this time onward I was never without some heroes toward whom I indulged a perfectly separate and tenderly ideal passion. The announcement that one was about to leave surprised me into a passionate fit of weeping. Yet my reserve was so great and my sense of isolation so crushing, that I made no effort at intimacy, and to one for whom I felt inexhaustible devotion, I barely spoke for the first 3 years, though meeting him daily. At this time the subjects of my contemplation had distinctly individualized methods of approach. Thus in one case I imagined we stood face to face in our night gear. Suddenly mine was stripped from me. I was seized and forcibly thrust under his and made to hang with my feet off the ground by my full weight on the erect organ which inserted itself between my thighs. So suspended, my body enveloped in the folds of his linen and my face pressed upon his heart, I underwent a castigation which continued until I was thrown down to receive a charge of urine over my prostrate body. Such images seemed to come independently of my will. It was at this time that I found a large pleasure in imagining contact with people whom I disliked. The prevailing note of these intimacies was always cruelty, to which I submitted with acute relish. I discovered, however, from the ordinary school experiences of corporal punishment, that it had no charm to me when administered for school offences, even from the hands under which at other times I imagined myself as delighting to receive pain. The necessary link was lacking. I had perceived on the part of my judge any liking for the operation. There would probably have been a response on my side. On one occasion I was flogged unjustly. Conscious as I was of its cruel instead of judiciary character, this was the only castigation I received which had in it an element of gratification for my instincts. At the same time I never forgave the hand that administered it. It is the only instance I remember in myself of a grudge nourished for years. Meanwhile, amid this chaos of confused love and hatred, the relish for cruelty and loathing for injustice, my first thoroughly romantic and ideal attachment was developing itself. I may say, of those to whom romance as well as physical attachment bound me, that they have remained unchangeable parts of my nature. Today, as it was 20 years ago, when I think of them the blood gushes to my brain, my hands tingle and moisten with emotion I cannot subdue. I am at their feet worshipping them. Of them my dreams were entirely tender. The idea of cruelty never touched the conception I had of them. But I return to that one who was the chief influence of my youth. Older than myself by only 3 years, he was of fine build and athletic, with adolescence showing in his face. My tremulous beginnings of worship were confirmed by a word of encouragement thrown to me one day as I went to receive my first flogging. No doubt my small, scared face excited his kind pity. I made it my concern afterward to let him know that I had not cried under the ordeal, and I believe he passed the word around that I had taken my punishment pluckily. So little contact had I with him that beyond constant worship on my part, I remember nothing till, about 3 years later, I received from him a kind, half-joking solicitation, spoken in clean and simple language. So terrific was my shyness and secrecy, that I had even then no idea that familiarity of this sort was common enough in schools. I was absolutely unable to connect my own sensation with those of the world at large, or to believe that others felt as I did. On this occasion I simply felt that some shrewd thrust had been made at me for the detection of my secret. He had drawn me upon his knee. I sat there silent, flushing and dumbfounded. He made no attempt to press me. He had, as he thought, said enough if I chose to be reciprocal. Beyond that he would not tempt me. A few years ago I heard of him married and prosperous. In following up my emotions in this direction I have far outstripped the period up to which I have given a complete exposition of my development. I must have been more than 12 years old before school life persuaded me to face, as taught by sniggering novices, the actual facts of sexual intercourse. At the same time I learned that I had means of extracting enjoyment from my own body in a definite direction which I had not till then suspected. A growing resistance on my part to his cold desires had led to a break with my former intimate. To the last he had taught me nothing, except distaste for himself. I now found ready teachers right and left of me. One of my schoolfellows invited me to watch him in the process of masturbation. The spectacle left me quite unmoved. The result appeared to me far less exciting than the discharge of urine, which, until then, I had associated with male virility. I was so accustomed to my own lone amorous broodings that the effort and the action required for this process, when I attempted to imitate it, disconcerted my thoughts and interfered with concentration on my own inventions. I had never experienced the pleasure accompanying the spasm of emission, and there seemed to be nothing worth trying for along that road. I desisted and returned to my reveries. I was now in a perfect maze of promiscuity. There must have been at least 50 people who attracted me at that time. I developed a liking for imagining myself between 2 lovers, generally men who were physical contrasts. It was my habit to analyze as minutely as possible those who attracted me. To gain intimacy with what was below the surface, I studied with attention their hands, the wrists where they disappeared, showing the hair of the forearm, and the neck. I estimated the comparative size of the generative organs, the formation of the thighs and buttocks, and thus constructed a presentment of the whole man. The more vividly I could do this, the keener was the pleasure I was able to obtain from their contemplated embraces. Till now I had been absolutely untouched by any moral scruples. I had the usual acquiescence in the religious beliefs in which I had been trained. It did not enter my head that there was any divine law, one way or the other, concerning the allurements of the imagination. From my 13th year slight hints of uneasiness began to creep into my conscience. I began, perhaps, to understand that the formulas of religion, to which I had listened all my life, with as little attention as possible, had some meaning which now and then touched the circumstances of my own life. I had not yet realized that my past foretold my future, and that women would be to me a repulsion instead of an attraction where things sexual were concerned. I had the full conviction that one day I should be married. I had also some fear that as I grew to manhood I might succumb to the temptations of loose women. I had an incipient revulsion from such a fate, and this seemed to me to indicate that moral stirrings were at work within me. One night I was amorously attacked in my bedroom by two of the domestics. I experienced an acute horror which I hid under laughter. My resistance was so desperate that I escaped with a tickling. I had been accustomed to sit on the servants' knees, a habit I had innocently retained from childhood. I can now recall in detail the approaches these women had been used to make me. At the time I was utterly oblivious that anything was intended. I was equally oblivious to things that had a nearer relation to my own feelings. In passing along a side street one night, I was overtaken by a man who began conversation on the weather. He asked me if I were not cold, and began passing his hand up and down my back. Then came a question about caning at school, whether certain parts of me were not sore, leading to an investigating touch. I put his hand aside shyly, but did not resent the action. Presently he was for exploring my trousers pockets, and I began to think him a pickpocket. Repulsed in that direction, he returned to rubbing my back. The sensation was pleasant. I now took him for a pimp who wished to take me to a prostitute, and as at that time I had begun to realize that such pleasures were not to my taste, I was glad to find myself at my destination, and said good-bye sharply, leaving him standing full of astonishment at his failure with one who had taken his advances so pleasantly. I could not bring myself to believe that others had the same feelings as myself. Later I realized my escape, not without certain amount of regret, and constructed for my own pleasure a different termination to the incident. I was now so possessed by masculine attraction that I became a lover of all the heroes I read of in books. Some became so vivid to me as those with whom I was living in daily contact. For a time I became an ardent lover of Napoleon, the incident of his anticipation of the nuptials with his second wife attracting it by its impetuous brutality. Of Edward I and of Julius Caesar. Charles II I remember by a caressing cruelty with which my imagination gifted him. Jugurtha was a great acquisition. Bothwell, Judge Jeffreys, and many villains of history and fiction appealed to me by their cruelty. I had become an adept in the mental construction necessary for the satisfaction of my desires. And yet up to that date I had never seen the nude body of a full-grown adult. I had no knowledge of the extent to which hair in certain instances develops on the torso. Indeed, my efforts at characterization centered, for the most part, around the thighs and generative organs. At this time one of my schoolfellows saw a common workman, known to me by name, bathing in a stream with some companions. All his body was, my informant told me, covered with hair from throat to belly. In face the man was coarse and repulsive, but I now began to regard him as a lovely monstrosity, and for many nights embraced the vision of him passionately, with face buried in the jungle growth of hair that covered his chest. I was, for the first time, conscious of deliberately and successfully willing not to see his face, which was distasteful to me. At the same time another schoolfellow told me, concerning a master who bathed with the boys, that hair showed above his bathing drawers as high as the navel. I now began definitely to construct bodies in detail. The suggestion of extensive hairiness maddened me with delight, but remained in my mind strongly associated with cruelty. My hairy lovers never behaved to me with tenderness. Everything at this period, I think, tended to draw me toward force and violence as an expression of amativeness. A schoolfellow, a few years my senior, of a cruel, bullying disposition, took a particular delight in inflicting pain on me. He had particularly pointed shoes, and it was his custom to make me stand with my back to him while he addressed me in petting and caressing tones. Just when his words were at their kindness, he would inflict a sharp stroke with the toe of his boot, so as to reach the most tender part of my fundament. The pain was exquisite. I was conscious that he experienced sexual pleasure. I had seen definite signs of it beneath his clothing. And though loathing him, I would, after had suffered from his kicks, throw myself into his imaginary embraces and indulge in a perfect rage of abject submission. Yet all the time I would gladly have killed him. At the age of 14 I went for a time to a farmhouse, where I was allowed to mingle familiarly with the farm laborers, a fine set of muscular young men. I became a great favorite, and, having childish, caressing manners a good deal behind my real age, I was allowed to take many liberties with them. They all lived under the farmer's roof in the old-fashioned way, and in the evening I used to sit on their knees and caress and hug them to my heart's content. They took it phlegmatically. It apparently gave them no surprise. One of the men used to return my squeezes and caresses, and once allowed me to put my hand under his shirt, but there were no further liberties. It was not until I was nearly 15 that the event happened which made me, for the first time, restless in my forced solitude. I was verging on puberty, and perhaps in the hope that I should find my own development met by a corresponding warmth, I again came into intimate relations with the companion whose frigid performances had caused me weariness and disgust. He was now a man, having reached majority. He put me into his bed while he undressed himself and came toward me in perfect nudity. In a moment we were in each other's arms, and the deliciousness of that moment intoxicated me. Suddenly, lying on the bed, I felt attacked, as I thought, by an imperative need to make water. I leaped up with a hurried excuse, but already the paroxysm had subsided. No discharge came to my relief, yet the need seemed to have passed. I returned to my companion, but the glamour of the meeting was already over. My companion evidently found more pleasure in my person than when I was a mere child. I felt moved and flattered by the pleasure he took in pressing his face against certain parts of my body. On a second occasion, one day I seemed involuntarily about to transgress decency, but again, as before, separated myself and remained ignorant of what it was on which I had verged my excitement. At another meeting, however, I had been allowed to prolong my embrace and to act, indeed, upon my full instincts. Once more I felt suddenly the coming of something acutely impending. I took my courage in my hands and went boldly forward. In another moment I had hold of the mysterious secret of masculine energy, to which all my years of delirious imaginings had been but as a waiting at the threshold, the knocking on a closed door. It was inevitable that from that day our intimacy should dwindle into dissolution, though other causes anticipated this natural decay. But I no longer found masturbation a dry and wearisome formula. In my novitiate I was disheartened to find how long it took me to dissociate myself from the contemplative and attach myself to the active form of self-gratification. But I presently found myself committed to the repetition of the act 3 times a day. On almost the last occasion I met my intimate, he showed me an exceptional ardor. At that meeting he proposed to attempt an act I had not previously considered possible. Far less had I heard that it was considered the worst criminal connection that could take place. I had a slight fear of pain, but was willing to gratify him, and for the first time found in my submission a union of the 2 amative instincts which had before disputed sway in me, the instinct for tenderness and the instinct for cruelty. Pedicatio failed to take place, but I received an embrace for which the first time gave me full satisfaction. My delight was enormous. I was filled with emotions. I have no words to describe the extraordinary charm of the warm, smooth flesh upon mine, and the rougher contact of the hairy parts. Yet I was conscious, even at the time, that this was but the physical side of pleasure, and that he was not and never could be one whom I might truly be said to love. I was now in my 16th year, and under the influence of these and many other emotions then, for the first time, beginning to seize me, a sense of literary power and a desire to express myself through imaginative channels began to take hold of me. I feared that my indulgence was having an enfeebling power on my faculties. I had begun to experience physical languor and depression, and certain religious scruples, the result of my early training, took hold of me. For the first time I became conscious of the ardors I felt toward my own sex were a diversion of the sex instinct itself, and to my astonishment and consternation I found by chance the practices I had already indulged in definitely denounced in the Bible as an abomination. From that moment began a struggle which lasted for years. I made a final breach with my former intimate, and thereupon a long dispute took place between the conflicting influences that strove for possession of my body. For a time I broke off the habit of masturbation, but I could not so easily rid myself of the mental indulgence, which was now almost an essential sedative for inducing sleep. At this time a visit to the seaside, where, for the first time, I was able to see men bathing in complete nudity, frankly in the full light of day, plunged me again for a time head foremost into imaginative amours, and my scruples and resolutions were flung to the winds. But on the whole, I had now entered a stage which, for want of a better term, I must describe as the emotionally moral. To whatever depth of indulgence I descended, I carried a sense of obliquity with me. I believed that I was a rebel from a law, natural and divine, of which yet no instinct had been implanted in me. I still held unquestioned the truth of the religion I had been brought up in, and my whole life, every thought of my brain, every impulse of my body, were in direct antagonism to the will of God. At times physical desire broke down these barriers, but I practiced considerable restraint physically, though not mentally, and made great efforts to conquer my aversion from women and extreme devotion for men without the slightest success. I was 30, however, before I found a companion to love me in the way my nature required. I am quite a healthy person, and capable of working at very high pressure. Under sexual freedom I have become stronger. End of Chapter 3, Part 9. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceoversbykirk.com. Chapter 3, Studies of the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 3, Sexual Inversion in Men, Part 10. History 22. T.J., aged 50, man of letters. Height 5 feet 7 inches. Weight 10 stone, but formerly much less. Belongs to an entirely normal family, all married and with children. Owing to the fact that my mother suffered from some malady the whole period of gestation prior to my birth, I came into the world so puny a child, so ill-nourished, that for some time the doctors despaired of my life. Till the age of puberty, though never ill, I suffered greatly from delicate health. I was abnormally sensitive and all my affections and passions extraordinarily developed. Owing to my brothers being much older than myself, I was thrown into the society of my sister. Till 8 years old she was my chief playmate. With her I played with dolls and abandoned myself wholly to the delights of an imaginary land which was much more real to me than the world around me. I never remember learning to read, but at 5 the Arabian Nights and Kingsley's Hereward the Wake were my favorite books. Living in the country, the society of other children was difficult to obtain. My whole affections centered in my father, my mother having died when I was a child. This affection for my father was rather a morbid passion which absorbed my life. I dared not leave his side for fear of a final separation from him. I would wake him when asleep to see if he still lived. To this day, though he died 26 years ago, his memory haunts me. My first abnormal desires were connected with him. I had seen him occasionally micturating in the garden alleys or out in the country. These occasions excited me terribly, and I would, if possible, wait till he had gone, and touch the humid leaves, drawing a terrible pleasure from the contact. Afterward, though he never suspected it, desire for him became a consuming passion, and I remember one occasion when, on a holiday, I occupied the same bed with him. The excitement of his propinquity brought on such a formidable attack of heart palpitation that my father called in the family physician on our return home. Needless to say, my heart was found quite sound. The desire still remains after all these years, and nothing excites me more even now than the memory of my father in his morning bath. The whole world for me in my early childhood was peopled with imaginary beings. While still a young child I would invent stories and relate them to any listener I could find, one such story lasting 3 years. I was an omnivorous reader, but my favorite reading was poetry. At 7 I could repeat the greater part of Longfellow's poems. Scott followed, then Milton captivated me when I was 14. Then came Tennyson, Arnold, Swinburne, and Morris. Later came the Greek and Latin poets. From 7 years on I wrote verses to my father. Till 8 years I was excessively timid of the dark and indeed of all loneliness. This passed, however, and developed into an extreme sensitiveness of seeing or meeting people. Even on a country road I would walk miles out of my way to avoid meeting the ordinary yokel. At this period my daydreams were my favorite occupation. Even to the present day my visions take up the greater part of my life. Though timid, I was not wanting in courage. At an early age I would fight boys even older than myself. Later I have risked my life many times in various parts of Europe. As regards sports, I can do a little of everything: swimming, riding, fencing, shooting, a little of each. Cricket and football I also played passably, but sports never interested me much. Literature became and is the passion of my life, and for some years has remained my sole occupation. At 8 years the sexual inversion began to manifest itself, though till I had attained 10 years of age I was practically quite innocent. At 8 years of age my family removed to another country, and I made the acquaintance of a little boy who attracted me sexually. We masturbated in company, without any reason except the pleasure of seeing each other exposed. Then I had a connection with him in anum. This really at that time was an exception to my ordinary tastes, which speedily developed into an intense desire of fellatio, and later on of intercrural pleasures. This latter perhaps may be accounted for by the visit to our house of a small boy, with whom I slept for about a year. Every night during this period I had intercrural connection with him twice, and sometimes 3 times. Then came a consuming passion for all young boys, and very old men. Boys after 14 or 15 ceased to attract me, more particularly when the hair of the pubes began to develop. From 8 to 14, when first I had sexual emissions, I masturbated at every opportunity. From 14 to 27, always once a day, generally twice, and sometimes 3 times a day. At 27 I took rooms and formed acquaintance with the family occupying the house. The boys, one by one, were allowed to sleep with me, and I conceived an extraordinary passion for one of them, an attachment which lasted till I finally left England. The attachment was much more than that of a man for his wife, and had nothing degrading in it. I was wretched when away from him, and as he was very attached to sport of all kinds, I suffered divers kinds of death each time that I imagined his life to be endangered. I can honestly say that in each of my attachments, and I've had many, the prevailing sentiment was the delight of protecting a weaker being than myself. Each person whom I have loved has been perfectly normal, and all are now fathers of families. Each still regards me with affection and respect, in spite of what has passed between us. All my life I have been possessed with the passion for paternity. I could almost say maternity. Willingly I would have suffered the pains of hell could I have borne a son to the person I loved. That I can honestly say has been the dominant instinct of my life. In my passion I have never been brutal, nor save under the influence of wine have I had connection with men over the age of puberty. In southern Europe my experiences have been the same, a predominant passion for a boy exhibiting itself in every species of protecting care, and though terminating so far as sexual passion was concerned when the boy reached 15 or 16 years, yet still lasting and enduring in an honest and unselfish affection. At the age of 51 I still masturbate once or twice a week, though I long for someone whom I love to share the pleasure with me. I tried vainly at the age of 27 to bring myself into line with others. Prostitutes caused me horror, whether male or female. I attempted the act of coitus 4 or 5 times, twice with women of loose lives and at other times with married women. Save in one case the attempts were either abortive or caused me extreme disgust. Practically from the time of puberty I have attracted sexually not only women but men. Women, oddly enough, though I care nothing for them sexually, either hate me or adore me, and I have had 5 offers of marriage. At the same time, up till 5 years ago, I was pursued by men and have the oddest experiences both in England and abroad. In the early period of this history I suffered tremendously from the feeling that I was isolated and unique in the world. I strove against the habit of masturbation and my perverted tastes with all my might. Scourges, vigils, burnings, all were of no avail. Deeper reading in the classics showed me how common was the taste of sex for the same sex. At 27 I began to have a settled philosophy. Then as now I made endless resolutions to avoid masturbation, though I can see nothing wrong in the mutual act of 2 persons drawn together by love. I am and always have been an extremely religious man, and if I am not altogether an orthodox Catholic, do my duties and have a high sense of the supernatural. I suffered much from melancholy from my earliest years. At 18, though nothing definitely was wrong, a vague but profound malaise induced me to open the veins of my arm. I fainted, however, and was promptly succored. At the age of 35, after a return from abroad, I took an enormous dose of poison. This time again a singular coincidence saved me, and I once more came back to life. After this I purposely went abroad to obtain death, and sought it in every possible way, quite in vain, as you see. One thing I have never had a fear of, but have always longed for, death. I am sure that if we only knew what joys lay on the other side of death, the whole world would rush madly to suicide. I have, apart from any perversion of taste, an honest and genuine passion for children and animals, and I am never happier than when in their society. Both adore me. My life has not dimmed nor deadened my faculties, for I am occupied at the present time with very important work and I write steadily. But my real life is passed in my visions, which take me to another world quite as real as this sensuous one, and where I always retreat on all occasions possible. And yet, a strange paradox, I am a convinced Stoic, and almost confine my reading to Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and the Imitation. I am extremely emotional, fond of the society of women, though I loathe the sexual side of them, and when I love, though passion is certainly inextricably mixed, the prevailing sentiment is spiritual. I shall probably end up by being a Carthusian or a faker. History 23. Englishman, aged 70, of German descent on the father's side. Was first child of his mother, who was 36 at his birth. A younger brother normal, has no other relatives. He was brought up in England and went to school at the age of 13. At a very early age, between 6 and 8, was deeply impressed by the handsome face of a young man, a royal trumpeter on horseback, seen in a procession. This, and the sight of the naked body of young men in a rowing match on the river, caused great commotion, but not of a definitely sexual character. This was increased by the sight of a beautiful male model of a young Turk smoking, with his dress open in front, showing much of the breast and below the waist. He became familiar with pictures, admired the male figures of Italian martyrs, and the full, rich forms of the Antinous, and he read with avidity the Arabian Nights and other Oriental tales, translations from the classics, Suetonius, Petronius, etc. He drew naked models in life schools, and delighted in male ballet dancers. As a child he used to perform in private theatricals. He excelled in female parts, and sang the songs of Madame Vestris, encouraged by his father. The sexual organs have never been fully developed, and the testicles, though large, are of a flabby consistence. He cannot whistle. He thinks he ought to have been a woman. At school he was shy and reserved, and had no particular intimacy with anyone, although he once desired it. He learned self-abuse from his younger brother, who had learned it from an older boy. He has never had erotic dreams. He never touched anyone but his brother until later when traveling in Italy, and then only his fellow traveler. When traveling in Asia Minor he had many opportunities, but always put them aside from fear, afterward regretting his fearfulness. He yearned for intimacy with particular friends, but never dared to express it. He went much to theaters, and what he saw there incited him to masturbation. When he was about 30 years of age, his reserve and his fear of treachery and extortion were at last overcome by an incident which occurred late at night at the Royal Exchange, and again in a dark recess in the gallery of the Olympic Theatre when Gustavus Brooke was performing. From that time the Adelphi Theatre, the Italian Opera, and the open parks at night became his fields of adventure. He remarks that among people crowding to witness a fire he found many opportunities. His especial intimates were a railway clerk and an Italian model. In more recent years he has chiefly found gratification among footmen and policemen. He is exclusively passive, also likes mutual fellatio. He used greatly to admire finely developed forms, conscious of his own shortcomings, shapely limbs and delicate brown hair, and always admired strength and manly vigor. He never took any interest in boys and has always been indifferent to women. History 24. A medical man, English, aged 30. He believes that his father, who was a magistrate, was very sympathetic toward men. On several occasions he has sat with him on the bench when cases of indecent assault were brought up. He discharged 3 cases, although there could be little doubt as to their guilt, and was very lenient to the others. From age of 9 he loved to sleep with his brother, 10 years older, who was in the Navy. They slept in different beds, and the child went to bed early, but he always kept awake to see his brother undress, as he adored his naked body, and would then get into his bed. He learned the habit of masturbation from his brother at the age of 9. At that time there was no sexual orgasm, but watching it in his brother was a perpetual source of wonder and pleasure. During his brother's absence at sea, the boy longed for his return, and would practice self-abuse with the thought of his brother's naked body before him. This brother's death was a source of great grief. At the age of 12 he went to boarding school and was constantly falling in love with good-looking boys. He was always taken into one of the bigger boys' beds. At this age he was thoroughly able to enjoy the sexual orgasm with boys. His erotic dreams have always been of men and especially of boys. He has never dreamed sexually of women. From the age of 9 to the age of 21, when he left school, he never gave women a thought sexually, though he always liked their society. For 2 years after leaving school he had connection with women, not because he thought there was sin in loving his own sex, but because he regarded it as a thing that no one did after leaving school. During these 2 years he still really preferred men and used to admire the figures of soldiers and sailors. He then paid a visit to London, which may be described in his own words. "I went to see an old schoolfellow who was living there. In his room was a young fellow, extremely good looking, with a good figure and charming manners. From that moment all my past recollections came back. I could not get him out of my mind. In fact, I was in love with him. I pictured him naked before me as a lovely statue. My dreams were frequent at night, always of him. For a fortnight afterward I practiced masturbation with the picture of his lovely face and form always before me. We became fast friends, and from that day women have never entered my thoughts. Although up to the present he has no wish or intention to marry, he believes that he will eventually do so, because it is thought desirable in his profession. But he is quite sure that his love and affection for men and boys will never lessen. In earlier life he preferred men from 20 to 35. Now he likes boys from 16 upward. Grooms, for instance, who must be good-looking, well-developed, cleanly, and of a lovable, unchanging nature, but he would prefer gentlemen. He does not care for the mere mutual embracing and reciprocal masturbation. When he really loves a man he desires pedicatio, in which he himself is the passive subject. He has curly hair and a mustache, and well-developed sexual organs. His habits are masculine. He has always enjoyed field sports, and can swim, ride, dive, and skate. At the same time he is devoted to music, can draw and paint, and is an ardent admirer of male statuary. While fond of practical occupations of every sort, he dislikes anything that is theoretical. He adds, "As a medical man, I fail to see morally any unhealthiness, or anything that nature should be ashamed of, in connection with and sympathy for men." History 25. A.S. Schoolmaster, aged 46. My father was, I should say, below the average in capacity for friendship. He liked young girls, and was never interested in boys. He was a man of strongly puritanical morality, capable of condemning with gloomy bitterness. He was also a man capable of great sacrifice for principle, and mentally very well endowed. My mother was a clever, practical woman with wide sympathies. She was capable of warm friendship, especially toward those younger than herself. Her father, whom I never saw, was a teacher. He was devoted to his wife, but also delighted in the company of young men. He had always some young man on his arm, my mother would tell me. My mother's family is of Welsh descent. I learned to read at 5, and I can scarcely have been more than 6 when I used to read again and again David's lament for Absalom. Even now I can dimly recall the serene charm for me of that melancholy refrain, "O my son, Absalom! O Absalom, my son, my son!" Of late, when I have thought of the amount of devotion I have shown to lads, and the amount I have sometimes suffered for them, I have felt as if there were something almost weirdly prophetic in that early incident. I was always an impressionable creature. My mother was very musical, and her singing got hold of me wonderfully. The dramatic and the poetic always strongly appealed to me. I felt I should like to act, but I never dared. In the same way, I felt that one day I should like to be a schoolmaster, but I dared not say so. A shy, retiring creature was obviously unfitted for such occupations. Well, the teaching came about, and the strange part was that the boys were somehow or other attracted to me, and the worst customers were attracted most. And there came a chance of acting, too. Owing to some difficulties about the cast in a play at school, I took a part. After that I knew that within a certain range I could act. I spent 2 holidays with the dramatic company. I should undoubtedly have remained on the stage, but for one thing. I don't wish to be sanctimonious, but dirty and ugly jokes are odious to me. It was this sort of thing that drove me away. I threw myself into the schoolwork instead. It was partly the dramatic interest, partly a quite genuine interest in human nature, that led me to do some preaching too. When I had been badly hurt by 1 or 2 youngsters whom I loved, I thought of going in for pastoral work. But this too was given up, and very wisely. I should never be able to work comfortably with any organization. For one thing, I have a way of taking on new ideas, and organizations do not like that. For another, all social functions are an anathema to me. Interest in art, as usually understood, began to be marked only after I was 30. It started with architecture and passed on to painting and sculpture. The tendency to do rather a variety, too great a variety, of things characterizes many Uranians. We are rather like the label chemical compounds. Our molecules readily rearrange themselves. As a boy of 10, I had the ordinary sweethearting with a girl of the same age. The incident is worth perhaps a little further comment for the following reason. When I was 16 years old, the girl lived with us for a year. She was a nice, pleasant, bright girl, and she thought a great deal of me. I was strongly attached by her. I remember especially one little incident. I had been showing her how to do some algebra, and she was kneeling at the table by the side of my chair. Her hair was flowing over her shoulders, and she looked rather charming. She expressed warm admiration of the way I had worked the problem out. I remember that I deliberately squashed out the feeling of attraction that came over me. I scarcely know why I did this, but I fancy there was a vague sense that I did not want my work disturbed. There was no sexual attraction, or, at least, none that was manifest. The girl, there was no doubt, grew to love me. I am sorry to say that in 2 other cases, later, women loved me, and both permanently remained unmarried on my account. I sometimes feel that in a wisely free society I should be able to give both of these women children. That I believe I could do, and I think it would be an immense satisfaction to them. A permanent union with a woman would, however, be impossible to me. A permanent union with a man would, I believe, be possible. At least I know that attractions which have been at all homosexual in character have in my case been very lasting. I was strongly attracted when not more than 13 to a lad slightly older. It was a love story, there was no doubt, but I do not recollect any outer sexual signs. There were other passing cases, but in no case was there any warm response till I was 15. I then made friends with a lad of entirely different type from myself. I was a reader. I liked long walks and fresh air, but I was too shy to go in for sports. Indeed, I was frightfully shy. He was a great sportsman and always at home in society, but he asked me to help him with some work, and we took to working together. I grew passionately fond of him. His caresses always caused some erection. Personally, I believe it would have been wiser to have obtained complete sexual expression. The absence of knowledge led to 2 distinctly undesirable results. The first was marked congestion and pain at times. The second was a tendency to a sort of modified masochism. There is always, I suppose, some erotic attraction about the buttocks, and of course also, to boys, they afford an irresistibly attractive mark for a good smack. I found that when this lad spanked me it produced some amount of sexual excitement, and the desire for this form of stimulus grew upon me. The result, in my case, was bad. It was sensualism, not love. I can say this with confidence, because in a much later case of deeply passionate love I shrank from any such method, but the mutual naked embrace I found was for me an absolutely natural and pure expression of love. I never felt any touch of grossness in it, and it destroyed the earlier and, for me at least, less wholesome desire. The school friendship disappeared with the marriage of my friend. I was furiously jealous, and the young man's mother was opposed to me, but I still think of that early friendship with tenderness. I know that my boyfriend was the first who made me capable of self-expression, the first who taught me how to make friends at all. And if he still cared for me, I know that his love would be dear to me still. My chief regret, as I look back, is that I did not know about these things early. I cannot but think that all youngsters should be spoken to about the love of comrades and encouraged to seek help in any sort of trouble that this may bring. We homogenic folk may be but a small percentage of mankind, but our numbers are still great, and surely the making or marring of our lives should count for something. At college I fell violently in love with a friend with whom I did work in science. He loved me too, though not with such heat. He also was largely Uranian, but this I only realized a year or two back. He remains unmarried and is still my friend. We did some research together which is pretty well known. I am quite sure that the love we had for each other gave tremendous zest to our work and greatly increased our powers. While I was working at college, I was interested in a lad who was working as an errand boy for a city firm. I helped him to get better training and spent money on him. My father was making me some allowance at the time and demurred. I said I would in future support myself, and in this way came to take up schoolmastering. I at once became quite absorbed in my work with the boys. Of course I loved them. And here I feel I must touch upon what seems to me a characteristic of most of us Uranians. Our genital organs are with us ordinarily and usually organs of expression. The clean-minded, heterogenic man is apt to look upon such a view of the genital organs as monstrous. We, on the other hand, are compelled, at least for ourselves, to regard it as the natural and pure one. For my own part, I had many Puritan prejudices that I retained from many a long and weary day, but my affection to those of my own sex so often expressed itself by some sexual stirring, and more or less erection, that I was obliged to look upon this as inevitable, and in general I paid no attention to it whatever. It was the older boys who sometimes attracted me strongly. My love for them was, I know, a genuinely spiritual thing, though inevitably having some physical expression. I was capable of great devotion to them and sacrifice for them, and I would certainly rather have died than have injured them. The boys got on well with me. I was never weak with them, and I was able to allow all kinds of familiarities without any loss of respect. The older boys, usually out of class, called me by my Christian name, and I remember one writing to ask me whether he might do so, as it made him feel nearer to me. A few of the lads I of course loved with special devotion. They kissed me and loved to have me embrace them. One of these was, I now know, pure Uranian, and there was in his case certainly some sexual response. But though I often slept with him, when he was a lad of 17 or 18, there was never any idea in our minds of any sexual act. We are still warm friends, and always kiss when we meet. Looking back upon those days, I feel that I was a little inclined to pass on from one love to another, but each was a genuine devotion, and involved real hard work on the lad's behalf. And I know that where the lad stuck to me into manhood a real tenderness and love remained still. While teaching I made the acquaintance of a nonconformist minister, who though happily married, had certainly some homogenic tendencies. He was most devoted to boys, and helped me with regard to some difficult cases. It was the difficult cases that always attracted me. I had to punish these lads, and my friend recommended spanking with the hand on the bare buttocks. I remember that I adopted this method, because it might have been thought specially dangerous to me. It certainly never produced in me the remotest suggestion of any sexual act, though it did sometimes produce a slight amount of sexual excitement. I disregarded this, or put it out of my mind, as I found the method most efficacious. It was capable of great variation of intensity, and the boys were always ready to joke about it. I never came across a case where any sexual excitement was produced by it. The boys whom I had to be most down on, almost always, however, grew fonder of me. There might be a slight and normal masochistic tendency in most boys, and perhaps the erogenic character of the buttocks has something to do with the development of affection. If so, I am inclined to regard it as normal and useful rather than otherwise, for in my experience no undesirable result was ever produced. But then, of course, there was no playing with the business. That might, I am sure, in some cases be decidedly injurious. One experience of my schoolmastering days is, I think, important in its bearing upon general sexual psychology. I always noticed that during the term I was specially free from wet dreams. What is noteworthy is this. During term there was never anything more than a very partial sexual expression of any feeling of mine, such expression indeed as was wholly inevitable. There was therefore no actual loss of semen, and it seems clear that the wet dreams were not due to mere physical pressure. The psychic satisfaction of love in this case made the complete physical expression less urgent, but it was a love of a distinctly tender kind that was needed to keep the physical from obtruding. Of that further experience has made me sure. I am moreover now convinced that a mutual Uranian love will reach its best results, both spiritual and physical, where there is complete sexual expression. Of the character of the sexual dreams I have had, there is not much to be said. During the period of masochistic tendency, they were masochistic in character. Otherwise, they have been dreams simply of the naked embrace. Usually there has been a considerable element of ideal love in the dream. I have not more than 3 times at most dreamed of intercourse with one of the opposite sex. There was only in one case anything that I could call actual emotion in such a dream. The other dreams have not often, not always, been dreams of real yearning, and not at all what I should call merely sensual. In the course of time I wanted more freedom to do things in my own way than could be obtained in a public school. I started a school of my own. The work was for a good many years very happy. I loved the boys and they loved me. I was active, ardent, and they made a chum of me. But people got into the way of sending me awkward customers, and I poured out my love on these. I used myself up for them. Unfortunately, though I was never orthodox, my puritanical morality was still strong within me. My views of human psychology were too limited, and I imposed them on the boys. Some were very devoted, but as years went by and the proportion of mauvais sujets increased, there tended to be a split in the small camp, and 1 or 2 boys whom I loved deceived me terribly. To a man of my temperament this was heart-rending, and from then the work was doomed. Troubles at school went along with troubles at home, and these things contributed to center my affection upon a lad who was with me, and who had given me much trouble. For some reason or other I went on believing that he would get right. Deceit was his great difficulty. He was certainly partly homosexual himself. Looking back I can see that with a wider and more charitable knowledge I could have dealt more wisely and helpfully with certain homosexual episodes of his. I am convinced now that mere sweeping condemnation of the physical is not the wholesale way of help. However, to cut the story short, all seemed at last to go well, and the lad was growing into a young man. Our love deepened, and we always slept together, but quite ascetically. Later, when quite in his young manhood he had left school, there was unfortunately misunderstandings with his parents, who forbade him to sleep with me. What followed is of some importance. Up till then, though certainly his affection seemed ardent, I had observed no sexual signs on his part. I had been quite frank with him as to mine. He was then 19, and I thought old enough to have things explained to him. Sleeping with him I had found peaceful and helpful, and more than once he told me that it greatly helped him. But after we were forbidden to sleep together, I found the passion in me more difficult to control, and it suddenly leaped out in him. We were still, however, rather ascetic, though we used to kiss each other, and we used to embrace naked. This produced emission not infrequently with me, but only once with him, though always powerful erection. I would not allow any friction. Perhaps this was a mistake. A more complete expression might have helped him. All my life I had been hungry for a complete response, and at one time the lad thought he could give it. He was then nearing 20. "I have never been so happy in my life," he said. It was a blow to me when I found he had mistaken his own feelings, but I was quite ready to accept what love he could give. I also never dreamed of any sort of insistence on sexual expression. With such love as he could give, I was quite ready to make myself content. "The true measure of love," wrote a Uranian schoolmaster to me once, "is self-sacrifice. Not what will you give, but what will you give up. Not what you will do for him, but what will you forego for his sake." I quote this gladly, for the conventional English moralists regard an invert as some kind of deformed beast. I can only say that I tried to realize the ideal which these words express. No moralist would have helped me one whit. The parents also separated us. They have done much harm by their mistake. How difficult it is for parents to allow freedom to their children. Their ideal is successful constraint, not free self-discovery. But in spite of them, and in spite of the separation, I know that my friend and I have helped each other. There is one fear parents have which I believe is unwarranted. As far as I have seen, I do not conclude that the early expression of homosexual love prevents heterosexual love from developing later. Where this love is part of the individual's inborn nature, it will show itself. I do, however, believe that a noble homogenic love in early life will sometimes help a lad to avoid a low standard of heterogenic attachment. The Greeks did well, at their best time, in cultivating and ennobling the homogenic love. Amongst us, as can be understood by all who know the working of society taboos, it is the baser forms that are unhindered, the noblest forms that are debased. We yearnings are, I think, dependent upon individual love. Many of us, I know, need to work for an individual to do our best. Is this the outcome of the woman in the Uranian temperament? And the tragedy of our fate is that we whose souls vibrate only to the touch of the hand of Eros are faced with the fiercest taboo of all that can give our lives meaning. The other taboos have been given up one by one. Will not this, the last taboos, soon vanish? I have known lives darkened by it, weakened by it, crushed out by it. How long are the Western moralists to maim and brand and persecute where they do not understand? End of Chapter 3, Part 10. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceovers by Kirk.com. Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 3, Sexual Inversion in Men, Part 11. The next case belongs to a totally different class from all the preceding histories. These, all British or American, were obtained privately. They are not the inmates of prisons or of asylums, and in most cases they have never consulted a physician concerning their abnormal instincts. They pass through life as ordinary, sometimes as honored, members of society. The following case, which happens to be that of an American, is acquainted with both the prison and the lunatic asylum. There are several points of interest in his history, and he illustrates the way in which sexual inversion can become a matter of medico-legal importance. I think, however, that I am justified in believing that the proportion of sexually inverted persons who reach the police court or the lunatic asylum is not much larger in proportion to the number of sexually inverted persons among us than it is among my cases. For the documents on which I have founded the history of Guy Olmsted, I am indebted to the kindness of Dr. Talbot of Chicago, well known from his studies of abnormalities of the jaw and face, so often associated with nervous and mental abnormality. He knew the man who addressed to him the letters from which I here quote. History 26. On the 28th of March, 1894, at noon, in the open street in Chicago, Guy T. Olmsted fired a revolver at a letter carrier named William L. Clifford. He came up from behind and deliberately fired 4 shots, the first entering Clifford's loins, the other 3 penetrating the back of his head, so that the man fell and was supposed to be fatally wounded. Olmsted made little attempt to escape, as a crowd rushed up with the usual cry of "Lynch him!" but wavered his revolver, exclaiming, "I'll never be taken alive!" And when a police officer disarmed him, "Don't take my gun, let me finish what I have to do." This was evidently an allusion, as will be seen later on, to an intention to destroy himself. He eagerly entered the prison van, however, to escape the threatening mob. Olmsted, who was 30 years of age, was born near Danville, Illinois, in which city he lived for many years. Both parents were born in Illinois. His father, some 20 years ago, shot and nearly killed a wealthy coal operator, induced to commit the crime, it is said, by a secret organization of 100 prominent citizens to whom the victim had made himself obnoxious by bringing suits against them for trivial cases. The victim became insane, but the criminal was never punished, and died a few years later at the age of 44. This man had another son who was considered peculiar. Guy Olmsted began to show signs of sexual perversity at the age of 12. He was seduced, we are led to believe, by a man who occupied the same bedroom. Olmsted's early history is not clear from the data to hand. It appears that he began his career as a schoolteacher in Connecticut, and that he there married the daughter of a prosperous farmer, but shortly after he fell in love with her male cousin, whom he describes as a very handsome young man. This led to a separation from his wife, and he went west. He was never considered perfectly sane, and from October 1886 to May 1889 he was in the Kankakee Insane Asylum. His illness was reported as of 3 years' duration, and caused by general ill health. Heredity doubtful, habits good, occupation that of a schoolteacher. His condition was diagnosed as paranoia. On admission he was irritable, alternately excited and depressed. He returned home in good condition. At this period, and again when examined later, Olmsted's physical condition is described as, on the whole, normal and fairly good. Height 5 feet 8 inches, weight 159 pounds. Special senses normal. Genitals abnormally small, with rudimentary penis. His head is asymmetrical, and is full at the occiput, slightly sunken at the bregma, and the forehead is low. His cephalic index is 78. The hair is sandy and normal in amount over the head, face, and body. His eyes are gray, small, and deeply set. The zygomae are normal. The nose is large and very thin. There is arrested development of upper jaw. The ears are excessively developed and malformed. The face is very much lined. The nasolabial fissure is deeply cut, and there are well-marked horizontal wrinkles on the forehead, so that he looks at least 10 years older than his actual age. The upper jaw is of a partial V shape, the lower well developed. The teeth and their tubercles and the alveolar process are normal. The breasts are full. The body is generally well developed. The hands and feet are large. Olmsted's history is defective for some years after he left Kankakee. In October 1892 we hear of him as a letter carrier in Chicago. During the following summer he developed a passion for William Clifford, a fellow letter carrier about his own age, also previously a schoolteacher, and regarded as one of the most reliable and efficient men in the service. For a time Clifford seems to have shared this passion, or to have submitted to it, but he quickly ended the relationship and urged his friend to undergo medical treatment, offering to pay the expenses himself. Olmsted continued to write letters of the most passionate description to Clifford, and followed him about constantly until the latter's life was made miserable. In December 1893, Clifford placed the letters in the postmaster's hands, and Olmsted was requested to resign at once. Olmsted complained to the Civil Service Commission at Washington that he had been dismissed without cause, and also applied for reinstatement, but without success. In the meanwhile, apparently on the advice of friends, he went into hospital, and in the middle of February 1894 his testicles were removed. No report from the hospital is to hand. The effect of removing the testicles was far from beneficial, and he began to suffer from hysterical melancholia. A little later he went into hospital again. On March 19th he wrote to Dr. Talbot, from the Mercy Hospital, Chicago. I returned to Chicago last Wednesday night, but felt so miserable I concluded to enter a hospital again, and so came to Mercy, which is very good as hospitals go, but I might as well go to Hades as far as any hope of my getting well is concerned. I am utterly incorrigible, utterly incurable, and utterly impossible. At home I thought for a time that I was cured, but I was mistaken, and after seeing Clifford last Thursday, I have grown worse than ever so far as my passion for him is concerned. Heaven only knows how hard I have tried to make a decent creature out of myself, but my vileness is uncontrollable, and I might as well give up and die. I wonder if the doctors knew that after emasculation it was possible for a man to have erections, commit masturbation, and have the same passion as before. I am ashamed of myself. I hate myself, but I can't help it. I have friends among nice people, play the piano, love music, books, and everything that is beautiful and elevating. Yet they can't elevate me, because this load of inborn vileness drags me down and prevents my perfect enjoyment of anything. Doctors are the only ones who understand and know my helplessness before this monster. I think and work till my brain whirls, and I can scarce refrain from crying out my troubles. This letter was written a few days before the crime was committed. When conveyed to the police station, Olmsted completely broke down and wept bitterly, crying, "Oh, Will, come to me! Why don't you kill me and let me go to him?" At this time he supposed he had killed Clifford. A letter was found on him as follows: Mercy, March 27th. To him who cares to read. Fearing that my motives in killing Clifford and myself may be misunderstood, I write this to explain the cause of this homicide and suicide. Last summer Clifford and I began a friendship which developed into love. He then recited the details of the friendship, and continued. After playing a Liszt rhapsody for Clifford over and over, he said that when our time came to die he hoped we would die together, listening to such glorious music as that. Our time has now come to die, but death will not be accompanied by music. Clifford's love has, alas, turned to deadly hatred. For some reason Clifford suddenly entered our relations and friendship. In his cell he behaved in a wildly excited manner, and made several attempts at suicide, so that he had to be closely watched. A few weeks later he wrote to Dr. Talbot, Cook County, Gaol, April 23rd. I feel as though I had neglected you in not writing you in all this time, though you may not care to hear from me, as I have never done anything but trespass on your kindness. But please do me the justice of thinking that I never expected all this trouble, as I thought Will and I would be in our graves and at peace long before this. But my plans failed miserably. Poor Will was not dead, and I was grabbed before I could shoot myself. I think Will really shot himself, and I feel certain others will think so too, when the whole story comes out in court. I can't understand the surprise and indignation my act seemed to engender, as it was perfectly right and natural that Will and I should die together, and nobody else's business. Do you know, I believe that poor boy will yet kill himself, for last November, when in my grief and anger told his relations about our marriage, he was so frightened, hurt, and angry that he wanted us both to kill ourselves. I acquiesced gladly in his proposal to commit suicide, but he backed out in a day or two. I am glad now that Will is alive, and I am glad that I am alive, even with the prospect of years of imprisonment before me. But I will cheerfully endure for his sake. And yet for the last 10 months his influence has so completely controlled me, both body and soul, that if I have done right, he should have the credit for my good deeds, and if I have done wrong, he should be blamed for the mischief, as I have not been myself at all, but a part of him, and happy to merge my individuality with his. Olmsted was tried privately in July. No new points were brought out. He was sentenced to the criminal insane asylum. Shortly afterward, while still in the prison at Chicago, he wrote to Dr. Talbot. As you have been interested in my case from a scientific point of view, there is a little something more I might tell you about myself, but which I have withheld, because I was ashamed to admit certain facts and features of my deplorable weakness. Among the few sexual perverts I have known, I have noticed that all are in the habit of often closing the mouth with the lower lip protruding beyond the upper, usually due to arrested development of upper jaw. I noticed the peculiarity in Mr. Clifford before we became intimate, and I have often caught myself at the trick. Before that operation my testicles would swell and become sore and hurt me, and have seemed to do so since, just as a man will sometimes complain that his amputated leg hurts him. Then, too, my breasts would swell, and about the nipples would become hard and sore and red. Since the operation there has never been a day that I have been free from sharp, shooting pains down the abdomen to the scrotum, being worse at the base of the penis. Now that my fate is decided, I will say that really my passion for Mr. Clifford is on the wane, but I don't know whether the improvement is permanent or not. I have absolutely no passion for other men, and have begun to hope now that I can yet outlive my desire for Clifford, or at least control it. I have not yet told of this improvement in my condition because I wished people to still think I was insane, so that I would be sure to escape being sent to the penitentiary. I know I was insane at the time I tried to kill both Clifford and myself, and feel that I don't deserve such a dreadful punishment as being sent to a state prison. However, I think it was that operation and my subsequent illness that caused my insanity rather than passion for Clifford. I should very much like to know if you really consider sexual perversion an insanity." When discharged from the criminal insane asylum, Olmsted returned to Chicago and demanded his testicles from the city postmaster, whom he accused of being a systematized conspiracy against him. He asserted that the postmaster was one of the chief agents in a plot against him, dating from before the castration. He was then sent to the Cook Insane Hospital. It seems probable that a condition of paranoia is now firmly established. End of Chapter 3, Part 11. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceovers by Kirk.com.
Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Geller. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2 by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 3, Sexual Inversion in Men. Part 12. The following cases are all bisexual, attraction being felt toward both sexes, usually in predominant degree toward the male. History 27. H.C., American, aged 28, of independent means, unmarried, the elder of 2 children. His history may best be given in his own words. I am on both sides distantly of English ancestry, the first colonists of my name having come to New England in 1630. Both my mother's and my father's family have been prolific in soldiers and statesmen. My mother's contributed 1 president to the United States. So far as I am aware, none of my antecedents have betrayed mental vagaries, except a maternal uncle who, from overstudy, became for a year insane. I am a graduate of 2 universities with degrees in arts and medicine. After a year as physician in a hospital, I relinquished medicine altogether to follow literature, a predilection since early boyhood. I awoke to sexual feeling at the age of 7, when, at a small private school, glimpsing bare thighs above the stockings of girl schoolmates, I dimly exulted. This fetishism, as it grew more definite, centered at last upon the thighs and then the whole person of one girl in particular. My first sexually tinged dream was of her, that while she stood near I impinged my penis upon a red-hot anvil and then, in beatific self-immolation, exhibited the charred stump to her wondering, round eyes. This love, however, abated at the coming of a new girl to the school, who, not more beautiful, but more buxom, made stronger appeal to my nascent sexuality. One afternoon, in the loft of her father's stable, she induced me to disrobe, herself setting the example. The erection our mutual handlings produced on me was without conscious impulse. I felt only a childish curiosity on beholding our genital difference. But the episode started extravagant whimsies, one of which persistently obsessed me. With these obviously compensatory differences, why might not the girl and I effect some sort of copulation? This fantasy, drawn exclusively from that unique experience, charmed with its grotesqueness only, for at that time my sense of sex was but inchoate, and my knowledge of it was nothing. The bizarre conceit, submitted to the equally ignorant girl and approved, was borne to the paternal hayloft, and there, with much bungling, brought to surprising and pleasurable consummation. In the 4 ensuing years I repeated the act not seldom with this girl and with others. When I was 11, my sister and I were taken by our parents to Europe, where we remained 6 years, attending school each winter in a different city, and, during the summer, traveling in various countries. Abroad my lust was glutted to the full. The amenable girl playmate was ubiquitous, whom I plied with ardor, at Swiss hotels, German watering places, French pensions, where not? Toward puberty I first repaired at times to prostitutes. Masturbation, excepting a few experiments, I never resorted to. Few of my schoolmates avowedly practiced it. Of homosexuality, my sole hearing was through the classics, where, with no long pondering, I opined it merely our modern camaraderie, poetically aggrandized, masquerading in antique habiliments and phraseology. It never came home to me. It attuned to no tone in the scale of my sympathies. I possessed no touchstone for transmitting the recitals of those ambiguous amours into fiery messages. The relation to my own sex was, intellectually, an occasional friendship devoid of strong affection. Physically, a mild antagonism. The naked body of a man was slightly repellent. Statues of women evoked both carnal and aesthetic response. Of men, no emotions whatever, save a deepening of that native antipathy. Similarly, in paintings, in literature, the drama, the men served but as foils for the delicious maidens who visited my aerial seraglios and lapped me in roseate dreamings. In my 18th year we returned to America, where I entered the university. The course of my love of women was now a little erratic. Normal connection began to lose fascination. As long ago I had formulated untutored the rationale of coitus, so now imagination, groping in the dark, conceived a fresh fillip for the appetite, cunilictus. But this, though for a while quite adequate, soon ceased to gratify. At this juncture, Christmas of my first college year, I was appointed editor of a small magazine, an early stricture of whose new conduct was paucity of love stories. Such improvident neglect was in keeping with my altering view of women, a view accorded to me by self-dissipation of the glamour through which they had been wont to appear. I had wandered somehow behind the scenes, and beheld, no footlights of sex intervening, the once so radiant fairies resolved into a raddled humanity, as likable as ever, but desirable no longer. Soon after this the Oscar Wilde case was bruiting about. The newspaper accounts of it, while illuminating, flashed upon me no light of self-revelation. They only amended some idle conjectures as to certain mystic vices I had heard whispered of. Here and there a newspaper allusion still too recondite was painstakingly clarified by an effeminate fellow-student, who, I fancy now, would have shown no reluctance had I begged him to adduce practical illustration. I purchased, too, photographs of Oscar Wilde, scrutinizing them under the unctuous auspices of the same emasculate and blandiloquent mentor. If my interest in Oscar Wilde arose from any other emotion than the rather morbid curiosity then almost universal, I was not conscious of it. Erotic dreams, precluded hitherto by coition, came now to beset me. The persons of these dreams were, and still are, invariably women, with this one remembered exception. I dreamed that Oscar Wilde, one of my photographs of him incarnate, approached me with a buffoon languishment and perpetrated fellatio, an act verbally expounded shortly before by my oracle. For a month or more, recalling this dream disgusted me. The few subsequent endeavors, tentative and half-hearted, to repristinate my venery were foredoomed, partly because I had feared they were, to failure. Erection was incomplete, ejaculation without pleasure. There seemed a fallacy in this behavior. Why coitus without sensual desire for it? No sense of duty impelled me, nor dread of sexual aberration. The explanation is this. Attraction to females was not expunged, simply sublimed. My imagination, no longer importing women from observation, created its own delectable sirens, grown exacting and transcendental, petitioned reality in vain. Substance had receded for good now, and soon even these tormenting shadows of it became even dimmer and dimmer, until they too at length faded into nothingness. The antipodes of the sexual sphere turned more and more toward the light of my tolerance. Inversion, till now stained with a slight repugnance, became aesthetically colorless at last, and then delicately retinted, at first solely with pity for its victims, but finally the color deepening with half-conscious inclination to attach it to myself as a remote contingency. This revolution, however, was not without external impetus. The prejudiced tone of a book I was reading, Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, by prompting resentment led me on to sympathy. My championing, purely abstract though it was to begin with, none the less involved my looking at things with eyes hypothetically inverted, an orientation for the sake of argument. After a while, insensibly and at no one moment, hypothesis merged into reality. I myself was inverted. That occasional and fictitious inversion had never, I believe, superposed this true inversion. Rather, a true inversion, those many years dormant, had simply responded finally to a stimulus strong and prolonged enough, as a man awakens when he is loudly called. In presenting myself thus sexually transformed, I do not aver having had at the outset any definitive inclination. The instinct, so freshly evolved, remained for a while obscure. Its primary expression was a feebly sensuous interest in the physical character of boys, in their feminine resemblances especially. To this interest I opposed no discountenance. For wantonness with women under many and diverse conditions, having long ago medicined my sexual conscience to lethargy, no access of reasons came to me now for its refreshment. On the other hand, intellectual delight in the promises of the New World, as well as sensuality, conduced to its deliberate exploration. Still, for a year, the yearning settled with true lust upon no object more concrete than youths whose only habitation was my fancy. A young surgeon, having read my copy of Psychopathia Sexualis, fell one evening to discussing inverts with such relish that I inquired ingenuously if he himself was one. He colored, whether confirmatively or otherwise I could not guess, in spite of his vehement no. Presently he very subtly recanted his denial. But to his counter-question I maintained my own no, lest he propose some sexual act, the point of aesthetics of my developing inversion would not yet concede, the boys of my imagination being still predominant. One evening soon after this, he convoyed me to several of the cafes where inverts are accustomed to foregather. These trysting places were much alike. A long hall, with a sparse orchestra at one end, marble-topped tables lining the walls, leaving the floor free for dancing. Round the tables sat boys and youths, Adonises both by art and nature, ready for a drink or a chat with the chance Samaritan, and shyly importunate for the pleasures for which upstairs were small rooms to let. One of the boys, supported by the orchestra, sang the jewel song out of Faust. His voice had the limpid treble purity of a clarinet, and his face the beauty of an angel. The song concluded, we invited him to our table, where he sat sipping neat brandy as he mockingly encountered my book-begotten queries. The boy prostitutes gracing these halls, he apprised us, bore fanciful names, some of well-known actresses, others of heroes in fiction, his own being Dorian Gray. Rivals, he complained, had assumed the same appellation, but he was the original Dorian. The others were jealous impostors. His curly hair was golden, his cheeks were pink, his lips coral red, parted incessantly to reveal the glistening pearliness of his teeth. Yet, though deeming him the beautifulest youth in the world, I experienced no sexual interest either in him or in the other boys, who indeed were all beautiful. Beauty was their chief asset. Dorian, further, dilated on the splendor of his female attire, satin corsets, low-cut evening gowns, etc., donned on gala nights to display his gleaming shoulders and dimpled, plump, white arms. Thus arrayed, he bantered, he would bewitch even me, now so impassive, until I would throw myself in tears of happiness into his loving embrace. My first venture upon fellatio was a month later, with the young surgeon. I confessed the whim to try it, and he acceded. Though this nauseous and fatiguing act, very imperfectly performed, was prompted mostly by curiosity, there arose soon a passional hankering for repetition. In short, appetence for fellatio grew slowly from that night of mawkish fiasco, and waxed eventually into a sovereign want. Perhaps miscarriage of that initiatory experiment was due to precipitance, incubation of my perverse instinct being not yet complete. A hiatus of a month now supervened, in which, while further fellatio was not attempted, my mind came always nearer to a reconcilement with the grossness of the act, and began to discover for its creatures some correlation in pretty boys beheld in the flesh. One evening, in Broadway, I conceived suddenly a full-fledged desire for a youth issuing from an hotel as I passed. Our glances met and dwelled together. At a shop window he first accosted me. He was an invert. With him, in his room at the hotel whence I had seen him emerge, I passed an apocalyptic night. Thereafter commerce with boys only in the spirit ceased to be an end. The images were carnalized, stepped from their framework into the streets. That boy, that god out of the machine, I see him clearly. His brown, curling hair, his eyes blue as the sea, his chest both arched and so plump, his rounded arms, his taper waist, the graceful swell of his hips and full, snowy thighs. I recall as of yesterday the dimples in his knees, the slenderness of his ankles, the softness of his little feet, with insteps pink like the inside of a shell. How I gloated over his ample roundness, his rich undulations. In the last 8 years I have performed fellatio, never pedicatio, with more than 300 men and boys. My preference is for boys between 15 and 20, refined, pretty, girlish, and themselves homosexual. Personally, barring this love for males, I am in all ways masculine, given to outdoor sports and to smoking and drinking moderately. In appearance I am but a boy of 18. My face and figure are generally considered beautiful. I am clean-shaven, with black curling hair, red cheeks, and brown eyes, features delicate and regular, bodium of medium height, everywhere practically hairless. By years of training I have attained like great strength and classic proportions, the muscular contours smoothly rounded with adipose tissue. My hands and feet are small. My penis, though perfectly shaped, is rather enormous, erect, 10½ inches in length, 7¼ inches in circumference. Some abetment of my apostasy from orthodox methods was, no doubt, this hypertrophy of the penis, which already in my 20th year had acquired its present redundance, rendering coitus impracticable with most women I essayed, and painful where insertion was effected. Since falling heir to inversion, a unique recurrence of normal desire, 6 years ago, persuaded me to attempt coitus with 11 or 12 prostitutes, and, strangely enough, with much of the old-time salacity and full erection, but, as it chanced, always with too great disparity of parts for success. A certain preciosity in the manner of this communication may be put down partly to the nature of the literary avocations with which the writer is by preference occupied, and partly, no doubt more fundamentally, to the special character of his predominantly aesthetic temperament and attraction to the exotic. An attraction for exotic experiences will not, however, suffice to account for the rather late development of homosexual tendencies, a late development which may be held to place this case in the retarded group of inverts. H.C. has himself pointed out to me that his aversion to women, beginning to appear in the 18th year, was already well pronounced before he had ever heard definitely of specific homosexual acts, and fully a year before he experienced the slightest sexual interest in men or boys. Moreover, while it is true that the actual tendency to homosexual attraction only appeared after he had read Krafft-Ebing and come in contact with inverts, such influences would not suffice to change the sexual nature of a normally constituted man. It may be added that H.C. is not attracted to normal males. As regards his moral attitude, he remarks, "I have no scruples in the indulgence of my passion. I perceive the moral objections advanced, but how speculative they are and constructive, while immediately inversion is the source of so much good." He looks upon the whole sexual question as largely a matter of taste. I regard the foregoing case as of considerable interest. It presents what is commonly supposed to be a very common type of inversion, Oscar Wilde being the supreme exemplar, in which a heterosexual person apparently becomes homosexual by the exercise of intellectual curiosity and aesthetic interest. In reality, the type is far from common. Indeed, an intellectual curiosity and an aesthetic interest, strong enough even apparently to direct the sexual impulse in any new channel, are themselves far from common. Moreover, a critical reading of this history suggests that the apparent control over the sexual impulse by reason is merely a superficial phenomenon. Here, as ever, reason is but a tool in the hands of the passions. The apparent causes are really the results. We are witnessing the gradual emergence of a retarded homosexual impulse. History 28. English, aged 40, surgeon. Sexual experiences began early, about the age of 10, when a companion induced him to play at intercourse with their sisters. He experienced no pleasure. A little later a servant girl began to treat him affectionately, and at last called him into her bedroom when she was partially undressed, fondled and kissed his member, and taught him to masturbate her. On subsequent occasions she attempted a simulation of intercourse which gave her satisfaction, but failed to induce emission in him. On returning to school, mutual masturbation was practiced with schoolfellows, and the first emission took place at the age of 14. On leaving school, he became a slave to the charms of women, and had frequent coitus about the age of 17, but he preferred masturbating girls, and especially in persuading girls of good position, to whom the experience was entirely novel, to allow him to take liberties with them. At 25 he became engaged, and mutual masturbation was practiced to excess during the engagement. After marriage, connection generally took place twice every 24 hours until pregnancy. "At this time," he writes, "I stayed at the house of an old schoolfellow, due of my lovers of old days. There were so many guests that I shared my friend's bedroom. The sight of his body gave rise to lustful feelings, and when the light was out I stole across to his bed. He made no objection, and we passed the night in mutual masturbation. We passed the next fortnight together, and I never took the same pleasure in coitus with my wife, though I did my duty. She died 5 years later, and I devoted myself heart and soul to my friend until his death by accident last year. Since then I have lost all interest in life." I am indebted for this case to a well-known English alienist, who remarks that the patient is fairly healthy to look at, but with neurasthenia and tendency to melancholia and neurotic temperament. The body is masculine and pubic hair abundant. One testicle shows wasting. Histories 29 and 30. I give the following narrative in the words of an intimate friend of one of the cases in question. "My attention was first drawn to the study of inversion, though I then regarded all forms of it as depraving and abominable, at a public school, where in our dormitory a boy of 15 initiated his select friends into the secrets of mutual masturbation which he had learned from his brother, a midshipman. I gave no heed to this at the time, though I remembered it in after years when immersed in Plato, Lucretius, and the Epicurean writers. But my attention was riveted to it at the age of 20, when I spent a holiday with A, a companion with whom I was, and still am, on terms of great friendship. We enjoyed many things in common, studied together, and discussed most unconventional matters, but not this. Previously, we had always occupied separate sleeping apartments. On this occasion, we were abroad in a country place and were compelled to put up with what we could get. We not only had to share a room, but a bed. I was not surprised at his throwing his arm over me, as I knew he was extraordinarily attached to me, and I had always felt a brute for not returning his affection so warmly. But I was surprised when later I awoke to find him occupied in fellatio and endeavoring to obtain my response. Had it been anyone else, I should have resented strongly such a liberty, and our acquaintance would have ended, but I cared for him too well, though never very demonstrative. This episode led to discussion of the topic. He told me that his sexual strength was great, that he had tested it in many ways, and that it was essential to his well-being that he should have satisfaction in some way. He loathed prostitution and considered it degrading. He felt physically attracted to some women and intellectually to others, but the two elements were never combined, and though he had been intimate with a few, he felt that it was not right to them, as he could not marry them because he held too high an ideal of marriage. He had always felt attracted to his own sex, and had kept up a platonic friendship with a college chum, X, to whom I knew he was passionately attached, for some years. Both considered it perfectly moral, and both felt better for it. Both abhor pedicatio. X, however, would never discuss the subject, and seemed half ashamed of it. A, on the other hand, though showing a great self-respect in all things else, feels no shame, though he says he would never discuss it except with close friends or if asked for private advice. A is the elder child of a military officer. His parents were 21 and 19 respectively at the time of his birth. Both parents are healthy, and the two children, both boys, have good constitutions, though the elder has the better. He is of medium height and slender limbs, proud carriage, handsome and intellectual face, classic Greek type, excellent complexion, charming manners, and good temper. The penis is large, the foreskin very short. He is fond of philosophy, natural science, history, and literature. He is reflective and patient rather than smart, but strong-willed and very active when roused, never resting till he has accomplished what he wants, even if this takes years. He sings excellently and is fond of cycling, boating, swimming, and mountain climbing. He enjoys excellent health and has never had a day's illness since he was 12 years of age. He says the only time he cannot sleep has been when in bed with someone who could not or would not satisfy him. He requires satisfaction at least once a week, twice or thrice in the hot season. He never smokes nor drinks beer or spirits. He is still single, but believes that marriage would meet all his needs. X is also an oldest child, of young and healthy parents between 21 and 24 at his birth, of different class. Father a builder. He is of pleasing but not handsome appearance, very sensitive, very neat, and methodical in all things, not very strong-willed, and very reserved to women. He is a very studious disposition, especially fond of philosophy, politics, and natural science, a good musician. Takes moderate exercise, but rather easily fatigued. Is generally healthy, but not over-strong. He is a vegetarian and was brought up as a free thinker. Until 2 years ago he was never attracted toward a girl. Indeed, he disliked girls, but he is now engaged. For about 18 months he has relinquished homosexuality, but has suffered from dreams, bad digestion, and peevishness since. He thinks the only remedy is marriage, which he is pushing on. He regards homosexuality as quite natural and normal, though his desires are not strong, and once a fortnight has always satisfied him. He was led to the practice by the reasoning of A, and because he felt a certain vague need, and this comforted him. He thinks it a matter of temperament and not to be discussed except by scientists. He says he could never perform it except with his dearest friend, whose request he could not resist. He has a long foreskin, flesh like a woman's, and is well proportioned. Both men are ardent for social reform, the one actively, the other passively engaged in it. Both also regard the law as to homosexuality as absurd and demoralizing. They also think that the law prohibiting polygamy is largely the cause of prostitution, as many women are prevented from living honest lives and being cared for by someone, and many men could marry one woman for physical satisfaction and another for intellectual. They were devoted to each other when I first knew them. They are still friends, but separated by distance. Both are exceedingly honorable, and the latter is truthful to a fault. According to later information, X had married and his homosexual tendencies were almost completely in abeyance, partly perhaps owing to the fact that he now lives quietly in the country. A has surprised his friends by his ardent attachment to a lady of about his own age to whom he has become engaged. He declares that he loves this woman better than any man, but nevertheless he still feels strong passion for his men friends. It is evident that the homosexual tendency in A is distinctly more pronounced than in his friend X. As is found more often in bisexual than in homosexual persons, he is of predominantly masculine type, possesses great vitality, and desires to exert all his faculties. He has a sound nervous system and is very free of all nervousness. He has written a scientific treatise and can study undisturbed amid violent noises. His voice is manly in singing deep bass. He can whistle. He is not vain, though well-formed, and his hands are delicate. His favorite color is green. The demonstrative warmth of his affection for his friends is the chief feminine trait noted in him. He rarely dreams and has never had an erotic dream. This he explains by saying, earlier than Freud, that all dreams not caused by physical conditions are wish dreams, and as he always satisfies his sexual needs at once, with a friend or by masturbation, his sexual needs have no opportunity of affecting his subconscious life. There may be some doubt as to the classification of the two foregoing cases. They are not personally known to me. The following case, with which I have been acquainted for many years, I regard as clearly a genuine example of bisexuality. History 31. Englishman, independent means, aged 52, married. His ancestry is of a complicated character. Some of his mother's forefathers in the last and earlier centuries are supposed to have been inverted. He remembers liking the caresses of his father's footmen when he was quite a little boy. He dreams indifferently about men and women, and has strong sexual feeling for women. can copulate but does not insist on this act. There is a tendency to refined, voluptuous pleasure. He has been married for many years, and there are several children by the marriage. He is not particular about the class or age of the men he loves. He feels with regard to older men as a woman does, and likes to be caressed by them. He is immensely vain of his physical beauty. He shuns pedicatio and does not much care for the sexual act, but likes long hours of voluptuous communion during which his lover admires him. He feels the beauty of boyhood. At the same time, he is much attracted by young girls. He is decidedly feminine in his dress, manner of walking, love of scents, ornaments, and fine things. His body is excessively smooth and white, the hips and buttocks rounded. Genital organs normal. His temperament is feminine, especially in vanity, irritability, and petty preoccupations. He is much preoccupied with his personal appearance, and fond of admiration. On one occasion he was photographed naked as Bacchus. He is physically and morally courageous. He has a genius for poetry and speculation, with a tendency to mysticism. He feels the discord between his love for men and society, and also between it and his love for his wife. He regards it as, in part at least, hereditary and inborn in him. History 32. C.R., physician, age 38. Nationality Irish, with a Portuguese strain. My mother came of an old Quaker family. I was quite unaware of sexual differences until I was about 14, as I was carefully kept separate from my sisters, and although from time to time strange longings which I did not understand possessed me, I was a virgin in thought and deed until that period of life. When I was 14, a cousin some years older than myself came to stay with us and shared my bed. To my surprise, he took hold of my penis and rubbed it for a time, when a most pleasant feeling seized me and increased until a discharge came out of my organ. He then asked me to do the same to him. We frequently repeated the process during the following month. I was quite unaware of any harm resulting. The same year I went to school, but none of my schoolmates for some time even suggested such actions, until a friend staying with us for the holidays one day in the bathroom repeated the process, and pressed his penis between my thighs, when a similar discharge took place. I shortly found out that several of my school friends and male cousins had the same desires, and an elder brother of my first introducer into sexuality repeatedly spent the night with me, when we would amuse ourselves in a similar way. A little later, my mother being away from home, I shared my father's bed, and he took my penis in his hand and pulled my foreskin back. I, in return, took hold of his, and found that he had an erection. I proceeded to rub him, when he stopped me, and told me that I should not do so, that when I was a little older I should love a woman to do it, and that if I did not rub myself and allow the other boys to do so, I would enjoy myself much more. I am quite certain that my father was inverted, as he frequently, if sleeping with me, used to press my naked body against his, and he always had a strong erection. On one occasion he rubbed me until I had a discharge, and then, turning over on his back, made me take his penis in my hand and rub him for a few minutes. I used to jest frequently with my father, as from my 17th year my penis was larger than his. I will return to my father a little later. When I was 17, a college friend shared my bed, and when undressing he said that he envied me my penis being so much larger than his. After getting into bed, he asked me to turn on my side, and I found that he was attempting pedicatio. I was astonished at his doing so, when he informed me that next to a woman this process gave most pleasure. However, nothing resulted, and this is the only experience of pedicatio that I have ever had. When I was 18 one evening, a college chum introduced me to a woman, and she was the first I ever had connection with. We went behind some rocks, and she took hold of my penis and pressed it into her body, lying against me. My father evidently suspected me when I came home, and a few days afterward told me that it was very dangerous to have anything to do with women, that I should wait until I was older, that when a boy became a man he ought to have a woman occasionally, and that if I ever had a nasty disease I should promptly tell him, so that I could be properly cured. At college I found several chums who were fond of sharing my bed and indulging in mutual masturbation, pressing our bodies together face to face until there was mutual discharge, but never again anyone who tried anal connection. A short time afterward I was in Brussels, and I paid my first visit to a brothel, a place close to the cathedral. I picked a girl of about 18 from 8 naked beauties paraded for my choice. She was avaricious and demanded 10 francs. I had paid 20 for my room and had only 2 left. I wanted her to play with me, but she only seized the penis and pulled me to her with such vigorous action that I discharged very rapidly. I was so disgusted with the result that I masturbated when I returned to my boarding house. A year later I paid Portugal a visit, and my friends there frequently brought me to brothels and also introduced me to ladies of easy virtue. I had connection with them. The Portuguese prostitutes never suggested anything unnatural, and in no instance did a male approach me for sexual purposes. When I became a medical student, I used to visit a Turkish bath frequently. On one occasion I playfully slapped a friend on the buttocks, when my father, who was present, told me not to do it, so as it was not proper conduct in public, that if I liked to do so to him or 1 or 2 others, it was no harm in private. Until I was 21, in the bath my father always covered his penis from my view, but after I attained my majority he always exposed himself and repeatedly showed me pictures of naked women. He also taught me the use of the condom. In my 24th year, a tall, handsome man who used to frequent the baths one day sat down beside me and playfully knocked my toes with his. He then pressed his naked thigh against mine, and a little later in the cooling room slipped his hand under my sheet and grasped my penis. He then asked me to meet him a few days later in the baths, saying I would be pleased with what he would do. I kept the appointment, and he took me into the hottest room, where we lay on the floor. In a few minutes he turned on his side and threw one of his legs across me. I got frightened and jumped up. He had a powerful erection, but I refused to lie down again, although he pulled his foreskin back to excite my desires. I was afraid of being surprised by another bather. Twice on future occasions I met this man, and he made advances. I believe that I would have yielded then if we had met at a private house. Shortly afterward I met an elderly gentleman at the baths, who also made advances to me, but from fear I resisted him. I also disliked him, as he had a foul breath and bad teeth. Besides, I was now able to go to the Continent and enjoy female charms to my heart's desire. After qualification I joined the army in South Africa, and to my astonishment found many of my comrades fond of male society. One officer who had been wounded shared my bedroom at a military hospital, and when undressing frequently admired my penis. We used to play with each other until we had powerful erections, but we never masturbated or tried any unnatural vice. I used to have connection with women as frequently as I could, and I visited the Turkish baths and found that several clients were abnormal, including one of the masseurs. The latter enjoyed playing with my penis, kissing, and tickling me. I married at 28. My married life has been normal, and my wife and I are still in love with each other. We have had several children. My last sexual experiences have been in Australia. Once in Sydney at the baths a fellow bather playfully began tickling me when I had an erection. He grasped my penis, I jumped up, and he asked me to do anything that I liked with him. I refused. Once on board a coasting steamer, a fellow passenger used to expose himself, posing as a statue. We became very familiar, and he wanted me to spend a night with him. I also refused his offers. I am very healthy and strong, fond of riding, fishing, and shooting. I lead a very active life. I am neither musician nor artist, but fond of hearing music, and I admire works of art. In person I am 6 feet high, inclined to fat. My body is very strong. My penis is 6 inches long in repose and 8 in erection. I can without fatigue discharge twice in the night and have connection at least twice a week. My scrotum is tense and both testicles large. I am rather slow at discharging. I have never had any desire to have connection with any other woman since marriage, but several times I have met men who attracted me. I have a friend, another doctor, who is very familiar with me, and if we spend a night together we will play with each other. I have a great desire for him to circumcise me. We have never indulged in anything beyond feeling or pressing our bodies together like schoolboys. My favorite color is green. My erotic dreams, when I have any, are of my wife or a male lover. Sexual inversion is more widespread than is popularly supposed, and I have never had any twinge of conscience after any of my affairs. I regard the homosexual instinct as quite natural, and, except in regard to my wife, it is stronger in my case than the heterosexual instinct. I have never initiated a youth into the sexual life, or had any desire to seduce a girl. Boys under 17 or persons of lower social class have no attraction for me. End of Chapter 3, Part 12. Recording by Tom Geller. Oberlin, Ohio, tomgeller.com. TOMGELLER.com. Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Geller. Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2 by Havelock Ellis. Chapter 3. Sexual Inversion in Men, Part 13. History 33. M.O., 30 years of age, born in the United States, of English father and mother whose father was Scotch, the rest of his ancestry being English of long standing in America, with a very little admixture of Dutch blood. He is 5 feet 8 inches in height, and has brown hair and eyes. No hereditary troubles so far are known. In childhood, for some time, "threatened with cholera," is subject to tonsillitis and a stubborn though not severe form of indigestion induced by sedentary habits. He is of quick, nervous temperament. Has an aversion from most outdoor sports, but a great aesthetic attraction to nature. Highly educated. As far back as he can remember, he lived in a house from which his parents removed when he was 4 years old. Before this removal, he remembers 2 distinctly sexual experiences. A cousin 5 years older was in the bathroom, seated, and M.O. was feeling his sexual organs. His mother called him out. On another occasion he was in a wagon house with a girl of his own age. They were lying on a carriage seat attempting intercourse. The girl's older sister came in and found them. She said, "I am going to tell Mamma. You know she said for you not to do that any more." With each of these clear memories comes the strong impression that it was but one among many. 5 years ago, M.O. met a man of his own age who had lived in that neighborhood at the same time. Comparing notes, they found that nearly all the small children in it had been given to such practices. The neighborhood was a thoroughly, "respectable," middle-class one. From it, M.O. removed to another of just about the same character, and lived there until he was 11 years old. Of this period his memories are very fresh and abundant. With a single exception, all the children between 5 and 14 years of age appear to have indulged freely in promiscuous sexual play. In little companies of from 4 to 12, they went where trees or long grass hid them from observation, and exhibited their persons to one another. Sometimes also they handled one another, but not in the way of masturbation. Of this last M.O. was wholly ignorant. Sometimes when 2 or 3 were together, intercourse was attempted. In M.O.'s case there was eager sexual curiosity and a more or less keen desire, but actual contact brought no great satisfaction. On 2 or 3 occasions girls practiced fellatio, and he then reciprocated with cunnilictus, but without pleasure. In all these plays he is sure that girls took the initiative as often as boys did. During all this period, M.O. had now one girl sweetheart and now another. This was conventional among the children, and was fostered by the banter of older persons. M.O.'s sexual curiosity was certainly greater in regard to the opposite sex. At this time, however, his homosexual interests appeared. With a boy 2 or more years older, he frequently went to some hiding place where they looked at each other's organs and handled them. He and another boy were once in an abandoned garden, and they took off all their clothes the better to examine each other. The other boy then offered to kiss M.O.'s fundament, and did so. It caused a surprisingly keen and distinctly sexual sensation, the first sexual shock that he can remember experiencing. He refused to reciprocate, however, when asked. Toward the end of this period there was a new and increasing development of another sort, not recognized then as at all sexual in character. He began to feel toward certain boys in a way very different and much keener than he had done thus far toward girls, although at the time he made no comparisons. For instance, there was a boy whom he considered very pretty. They visited each other often and spent long times playing together. In school they looked and looked at each other until delicious, uncontrollable giggling spells came on. Sexual matters were never discussed or thought of. These experiences were, in their way, very sentimental and ideal. M.O. is sure that with himself the main consideration was always the other boy's beauty. He began to recall with great fondness a certain much older and very handsome youth who had lived near him in the first neighborhood, and had at the time shown him various little friendly attentions. He seldom saw him now, and hardly sought to do so, yet was immensely pleased by a casual word or look from him in the schoolyard, and much interested when other people spoke of him. A cousin about 2 years younger than M.O. often visited him and slept with him. They were very fond of each other, and handled each other's organs. When M.O. was about 11 years of age, the family removed to a distant neighborhood where there were almost no children of his own age, and where any association with those in the one he just left was practically impossible. From this time until the changes of puberty were well under way, his sexual life contrasted strongly in its solitude with the former promiscuity. He remembers liking to wrestle with 2 or 3 schoolboys and get their heads between his legs. He thinks they were not aware of his sexual impulses. He consciously flirted with certain schoolgirls, but never even suggested anything sexual to them. He read a few family medical books. One day, lying on an old, uneven couch, innocently enough at first, he induced a new and delicious sensation altogether different from any he had ever dreamed of, something far beyond the satisfaction of mere curiosity. He repeated the thing, and before long produced emissions. Masturbation soon followed. Certain days he would perform the act 2 or 3 times, but again he would avoid it for days. He began at once to fight the tendency, and felt very guilty and very ashamed for indulging it. He prayed for help, and at times wept over his failures to break the habit so quickly formed. For a certain period, after 2 or 3 years, he seemed to have succeeded, but he observed that he had intense erotic dreams with copious emissions regularly every 8 days. Just then certain newspaper advertisements fell under his eye, and these persuaded him that he had produced in himself a diseased condition. He never resorted to the remedies advertised, but he was discouraged in his efforts to overcome the bad habit. And since the evil effects appeared to consist only in the seminal losses, he concluded that he might as well have the greater enjoyment of masturbation. For a short time he remembers that he had an intense but revolting interest in the sexual organs of animals, especially horses. The males were much more interesting. Gradually he began to develop, entirely from within, the ideal of a male comrade, a beautiful, emotional boy between whom and himself there might exist a powerful, romantic passion. He lay for hours dreaming of this, and inventing thrilling situations. Suddenly at church he became acquainted with the very youth, Edmund, who seemed to satisfy all his longings. M.O. was then 16½ and Edmund 15. A real wooing ensued, Edmund finally yielding to the physical appeals of M.O. after several fits of misgiving. The yielding was, in the end, complete, however. The two spent night after night together, enjoying intercrural intercourse and sometimes mutual masturbation. Their parents may have been slightly uneasy at times, but the connection continued uninterruptedly for a year and a half or more. In the meantime, M.O. occasionally had relations with other boys, but never wavered in his real preference for Edmund. For girls he had no sexual desire whatever, though he was much associated with them. Then M.O. and Edmund went to college at different places, but they met in vacations and wrote frequent and ardent love letters. Both had genuine attacks of love-sickness and of jealousy. As M.O. looks back on this first love-passion, he can by no means regret it. It doubtless had great formative influence. After the first year at college, Edmund transferred to another school farther away from M.O., and the opportunities for meeting became rarer, but their affection was maintained and the intercourse resumed whenever it was possible. Gradually, however, Edmund became interested in women and finally married. M.O. also formed relations repeatedly with college friends and occasionally with others. On the whole, M.O. preferred boys a year or two younger than himself, but as he grew older the age difference increased. At 30 he regarded himself as virtually, quote, engaged, end quote, to a youth of 17, one unusually mature, however, and much larger than himself. M.O. is always unhappy unless his affections have fairly free course. Life has been very disappointing to him in other respects. His greatest joys have come to him in this way. If he is able to consummate his present plan of union with the youth just referred to, he will feel that his life has been crowned by what is for him the best possible end. Otherwise, he declares, he would not care to live at all. He admires male beauty passionately. Feminine beauty he perceives objectively, as he would any design of flowing curves and delicate coloring, but it has no sexual charm for him whatever. Women have put themselves in his way repeatedly, but he finds himself more and more irritated by their specifically feminine foibles. With men generally, he is much more patient and sympathetic. The first literature that appealed to him was Plato's Dialogues, first read at 20 years of age. Until then he had not known but what he stood alone in his peculiarity. He read what he could of classic literature. He enjoys Pater, appreciating his attitude toward his own sex. 4 or 5 years later he came across Rafalovich's book, and ever since has felt a real debt of gratitude to its author. M.O. has no wish to injure society at large. As an individual, he holds that he has the same right to be himself that anyone else has. He thinks that while boys of from 13 to 15 might possibly be rendered inverts, those who reach 16 without it cannot be bent that way. They may be devoted to an invert enough in other ways to yield him what he wishes sexually, but they will remain essentially normal themselves. His observations are based on about 30 homosexual relationships that have lasted various lengths of time. M.O. feels strongly the poetic and elevated character of his principal homosexual relationships, but he shrinks from appearing too sentimental. With regard to the traces of feminism in inverts, he writes, "Up to the age of 11 I associated much with a cousin 5 years older, the one referred to above, and took great delight in a game we often played, in which I was a girl. A never-ending romance, a non-sexual love story. Somewhat later and until puberty I took great delight in acting, but generally took female roles, wearing skirts, shawls, beads, wigs, headdresses. When I was about 13 my family began to make fun of me for it. I played secretly for a while, and then the desire for it left, never to return. There still lingers, however, a minor interest, which began before puberty, in valentines. My feeling for them is much like my feeling for flowers. Before I reached puberty I was sometimes called a sissy by my father. Such taunts humiliated me more than anything else has ever done. After puberty my father no longer applied the term, and gradually other persons ceased to tease me that way. The sting of it lasted, though, and led me more than once to ask intimate friends, both men and women, if they considered me at all feminine. Every one of them has been very emphatically of the opinion that my rational life is distinctively masculine, being logical, impartial, skeptical. One or two have suggested that I have a finer discrimination than most men, and that I take care of my rooms somewhat as a woman might, though this does not extend to the style of decorations. One man said that I lacked sympathy with certain "grosser manifestations of masculine character, such as smoking." Some women think me unusually observing of women's dress. My own is by no means effeminate. In a muscular way I have average strength, but am supple far beyond what is usual. If trained for it early, I believe I would have made a good contortionist. I have never had the least inclination to use tobacco, generally take neither tea nor coffee, and seldom any liquor, never malt liquors. The dessert is always the best part of the meal. These tastes I attribute largely to my sedentary life. When out camping I observed a marked change in the direction of heartier foods and mild stimulants. My physical courage has never been put to the test, but I observe that others appear to count on it. I am very aggressive in matters of religious, political, social opinion. In moral courage I am either reckless or courageous. I do not know which. I am perhaps a better whistler than most men. When I was quite little, my grandmother taught me to do certain kinds of fancy work, and I continued to do a little from time to time until I was 24. Then I became irritated over a piece that troubled me, put it in the fire, and have not wanted to touch any since. As a pet economy, I continue to do nearly all of my own mending. I have a decided aversion for much jewelry. My aestheticism is very pronounced as compared with most of the men with whom I associate, although I have never been able to give it much scope. It makes for cleanliness, order, and general good taste. My dress is economical and by no means fastidious, yet it seems to be generally approved. I have been complimented often on my ability to select appropriate presents, clothing, and to arrange a room. M.O. states that he practices the love bite at times, though very gently. He often wants to pinch one who interests him sexually. He considers very silly the statement somewhere made that inverts are always liars. Very few people, he says, are perfectly honest, and the more dangerous society makes it for a man to be so, the less likely he is to be. While he himself has been unable in 2 or 3 instances to keep promises made to withhold from sexual intercourse with certain attractive individuals, he has never otherwise been guilty of untruth about his homosexual relations. The foregoing narrative was received 8 years ago. During this interval, M.O.'s health has very greatly improved. There has been a marked increase in outdoor activities and interests. 2 years since, M.O. consulted a prominent specialist who performed a thorough psychoanalysis. He informed M.O. that he was less strongly homosexual than he himself supposed, and recommended marriage with some young and pretty woman. He attributed the homosexual bent to M.O.'s having had his "nose broken" at the age of 6 by the birth of a younger brother, who from that time on received all the attention and petting. M.O. had continued, up to that age, very affectionate toward his mother and dependent on her. He can remember friends and neighbors commenting on it. At first M.O. was inclined to reject this suggestion of the specialist, but on long reflection he inclines to believe that it was indeed a very important factor, though not the sole one. From his later observations of children and comparisons of these with memories of his own childhood, M.O. says he is sure he was affectionate and demonstrative much beyond the average. His greatest craving was for affection, and his greatest grief the fancied belief that no one cared for him. At 10 or 11 he attempted suicide for this reason. Also as a result of the psychoanalysis, but trying to eliminate the influence of suggestion, he recollects and emphasizes more the attraction he felt toward girls before the age of 12. Had his sexual experiences subsequently proved normal, he doubts if those before 12 could be held to give evidence of homosexuality, but only of precocious nervous and sexual irritability, greatly heightened and directed by the secret practices of the children with whom he associated. He does not see why these experiences should have given him a homosexual bent any more than a heterosexual one. The psychoanalysis recalled to M.O. that during the period of early flirtation he had often kissed and embraced various girls, but likewise he recalled having observed at the same time, with some surprise, that no definitely sexual desire arose, though the way was probably open to gratify it. Such interest as did exist ceased wholly, or almost so, as the relation with Edmund developed. There was no aversion from the company of girls and women, however. The intellectual friendships were mainly with them, while the emotional ones were with boys. Very recently, M.O. spent several days with Edmund, who has been married for several years. With absolutely no sexual interest in each other, they nevertheless found a great bond of love still subsisting. Neither regrets anything of the past, but feels that the final outcome of their earlier relation has been good. Edmund's beauty is still pronounced and is remarked by others. In spite of his precocious sexuality, M.O. had from the very first an extreme disgust for obscene stories and for any association of sexual things with filthy words and anecdotes. Owing in part to this, and in part to his temperamental skepticism, he disbelieved what associates told him regarding sexual emissions, only becoming convinced when he actually experienced them. And the facts of reproduction he denied indignantly until he read them in a medical work. Until he was well over 25, the physical aversion from any thought of reproduction was intense. He knows other normal young men who have felt the same way, but he believes it would be prevented or overcome by sex education such as now being introduced in American schools. Again, as to traces of feminism, perhaps 2 years ago all impulse to give the love bite disappeared suddenly. There has been lately a marked increase of dramatic interest, arising in perfectly natural ways, without any of the peculiarities noted before. The childish pleasure in valentines has all gone. M.O. believes that circumstances have lately been more favorable for the development of a more robust aestheticism. For some years he has heard no definite reproach for feminism, though some persons tell his friends that he is, quote, very peculiar, end quote. He forms many intimate, enduring, non-sexual friendships with both men and women, and he doubts if the peculiarity noted by others is due so much to his homosexuality as it is to his aestheticism, skepticism, and the unconventional opinions which he expresses quite indiscreetly at times. With the improvement in general health has come the changes that would be expected in food and other matters of daily life. Resuming his narrative at the point where the earlier communication left it, M.O. says that about a year after that time, the youth of 17 to whom he had considered himself virtually engaged withdrew from the agreement so far as it bore on his own future, but not from the sentimental relation as it existed. Although separated most of the time by distance, the physical relation was resumed whenever they met. Subsequently, however, the young man fell in love with a young woman and became engaged to her. His physical relation with M.O. then ceased, but the friendship otherwise continues strong. Shortly after the first break in this relation, M.O. became, through the force of quite unusual circumstances, very friendly and intimate with a young woman of considerable charm. He confided to her his abnormality and was not repulsed. To others their relation probably appeared that of lovers, and a painful situation was created by the slander of a jealous woman. M.O. felt that in honor he must propose marriage to her. The young woman was non-committal, but invited M.O. to spend several months at her home. Shortly after his arrival a sad occurrence in his own family compelled him to go away, and they did not meet again for 4 years. They corresponded, but less and less often. His relations with boys continued. Before his final meeting with her he became acquainted with a woman whom he has since married. The acquaintance began in a wholly non-sentimental community of interests in certain practical affairs, and very gradually widened into an intellectual and sympathetic friendship. M.O. had no secrets from this woman. After a full and prolonged consideration of all sides of the matter, they married. Since that event he has had no sexual relations except with his wife. With her they are not passionate, but they are animated by the strong desire for children. Of the parental instinct he had become aware several years before this. M.O. believes that no moral stigma should be attached to homosexuality until it can be proved to result from the vicious life of a free moral agent, and of this he has no expectation. He believes that much of its danger and unhappiness would be prevented by a thorough yet discreet sex education such as should be given to all children, whether normal or abnormal. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Tom Geller, Oberlin, Ohio. Website tomgeller.com, TOMGELLER.com.